Okay, I hope everybody on Zoom can hear us and see us. Thank you for your patience. As we've been trying to battle technology here and at the Chase Center at the Fletcher School at Tufts. My name is Bhaskar Chakravorty. I'm Dean of Global Business at Fletcher, and I'm joined by my colleague, Professor Joel Trackman, Professor of International Law, Henry Bracker, Professor of Commercial Law, who's co-chairing this conference with me. Let me bring Joel to the lectern. We are glad to have all of you join us on a topic that I'm sure each one of us has experienced in different ways. We have either been frustrated by the level of disinformation, harmful content on digital platforms, or we have tried ways in which we fight back against it. So today's conference or unconference is really an opportunity for us to try and understand what kind of solutions we might bring to bear on this issue, which is a live issue. In fact, today's big news is Kanye West has been kicked off of Twitter. That's certainly not a solution. I guess it's a solution to one problem, but not a solution to the larger problems. We are looking forward to doing something more systemic. We are glad to have resolved the technical issue, at least for now, here in the room. And let me turn this over to Joel to offer his opening remarks, and we'll lay out a bit of a game plan for the day, and we'll get going. Joel.
Well, thank you, Bhaskar, and thank you to all those who are helping to organize this. The idea of this conference, or this unconference, is to really try to understand what the international implications are of regulation of platform content moderation. And it started with some discussion of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act in the United States. Bhaskar has been leading this with me, and we've had a wonderful group of research assistants, principally Arpita Sai, Dominic Hofstetter, and it's been quite a project. The project began with the idea of trying to compare moderation in multiple jurisdictions, multiple countries, and plus the European Union as a jurisdiction. And so our first panel will focus on what we learned from comparing those different jurisdictions: the United States, the European Union, India, Brazil, and China, with interestingly different approaches to this issue. In our second panel, we'll start to pose questions about how to deal with international aspects of this problem, which I'll describe in a little more detail in a moment. And that will include questions about how governments might work together, how private sector actors might respond to these kinds of problems, what the technical responses to these issues are. And then in our third panel, we'll approach what we've called a generative way of thinking about ideas, looking across other areas of international cooperation to get an idea of what kinds of mechanisms in analogical kinds of contexts might be used, how might those things apply in this context. But, you know, it's interesting to think about the fundamental problem here. And the fundamental problem, I think, is that these platforms that we're focusing on are media, and they accentuate a kind of velocity and interaction and cross-jurisdiction, cross-border activity in a way that we have not experienced. And that social change, that technological change, causes social change, which for me as a lawyer becomes interesting as a basis for, as a set of changes that cause a need for legal change. And the legal change, I think, might come from governments, not come from international law. And that's part of what we're trying to focus on. So that's what we're planning to do today as we move forward. And now I'll turn it back to Bhaskar to get things started.
Okay, so I think we are ready to go into our first panel since we've already been delayed. Let me just check if Professor Josephine Wolf is here in the room. She's not here yet, so we're just waiting on her to arrive in a few moments. I think this is a good opportunity for us to also acknowledge our partner, Omidyar Network, who have been our steady supporters through this project. And Omidyar and the team at Omidyar has been just a tremendous a group of discussion partners in this issue. And we've had a number of conversations with them over the course of this project. Let me take this opportunity to introduce Omidyar Network to say a few words about why this issue, as it relates to catching, moderating, controlling the spread of online disinformation, is important to Omidyar Network and for the responsible tech team that Omidyar leads. Omidyar, go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bhaskar and Joel, and thank you to the entire team. It's been, I know, a lot of work to get this together, and we're really excited to see this going off. As Bhaskar said, I'm part of the Omidyar Network Responsible Tech team. Omidyar Network, for those of you who don't know, is a social change venture that's committed since 2004 over $1 billion to innovative for-profit companies and nonprofit organizations in the belief that we can reimagine critical systems and the ideas that govern them, and to build more inclusive and equitable societies in which individuals have the social, economic, and democratic power to thrive. We work across a set of areas, including building cultures of belonging, that's about pluralism, on reimagining capitalism, where we do a lot of work on capital markets and the economy, and then, of course, on responsible tech, which is the reason we're here today. And what we believe about responsible tech has changed over the last 20 years, as you can imagine. We now think that it's incredibly important that digital technology, which is ubiquitous in our lives, should be guided by a democratic vision of a good society. It should be in service to society and not the other way around. And we're not that sure today that without the right frameworks and without the right governance systems and without the right checks and balances that we can get there. At Omidyar, we work on a set of different areas. We work on data paradigms. We believe we're in the data century, and we think about how we can govern the vast troves of network data that exists today to benefit everybody and not just a few. We work on platform accountability and making private messaging and open messaging systems safer. And then we also work on making, as Joel said, some of the generative systems better, building better technology, supporting better technology creation, supporting open source technology, and so on. All of which I think is really important. We came to this particular project, and it's been wonderful to see it evolve, because we know that some of the novel challenges that we face today, particularly when it comes to content moderation, disinformation, dangerous speech online, etc., are really interwoven into a complex global system where there's many disparate approaches being tried, and there's no consensus on whether anything should be tried or what works. And we thought that partnering with the team at Fletcher and Tufts, who have such deep networks in the global policy community, who have such excellent partners all around the world, and can be a convener and a thinker for this work and a driver for this work, it would allow us to look at different approaches, different sectors, different analogs, and different ways of bringing to bear some really interesting creative thinking on this topic, and see if we could get those ideas to collide, and see if we could get some kind of a synthesis that said that certain approaches might have more merit than others and other approaches might not, and get some way to actually make sense of the very disparate ways in which different national jurisdictions and sometimes subnational or regional jurisdictions are trying to get at the problem of content moderation, disinformation, and the effects it has on our democratic systems and discourse. So we're really happy to be here to support this work. I must especially thank all the speakers and panelists who have prepared a lot of work to be here today and to say all the things they're going to say. We think this will be a tremendous exchange of ideas, and thank you for having this. And thank you to everyone who.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I'm Josephine Wolf. I'm an associate professor of cybersecurity policy here at the Fletcher School. I'm so excited to moderate this panel today, which is focused on thinking about content moderation and platform policy and regulation in a bunch of really important regions around the world. And trying to sort of think about this not just from the US perspective, which is often where we start, partly because many of these platforms are headquartered here in the US, and many of the people who run them come out of a very sort of US policy and law-centric approach, thinking about free speech, thinking about what kinds of rules do and don't make sense when you try to regulate what people can and can't say, not just at the government level, but also at the corporate level. But there are, of course, also a number of other countries around the world where, oh, no, bring back that stuff. Have the names for everybody, please. And there are a number of other countries around the world where these platforms have tremendous impact, and where the rules and the expectations and the norms are extremely different. And one of the really crucial questions that this project sets out to try and answer is, how much potential is there for convergence there? How much sort of overlap is there in the ways that we think about trying to establish some sorts of global norms or ideas for content moderation? And I think one of the things we see when we look at this sort of range of issues is there are some areas where there does seem to be a lot of potential for convergence, a lot of potential for countries to agree with each other, and there are some areas where we really don't see that. So coming from cybersecurity, one of the areas of cybercrime you worry about a lot is child sexual abuse materials. That's an area where we see a fair bit of convergence around the world. We see a lot of countries where that's illegal. We see a lot of cooperation in terms of how do you sort of remove that content, how do you report that content, everything like that. What we don't see is the same kind of convergence around issues of political speech, for instance, where you see huge spectrum in terms of what should be allowed, what countries think is and is not appropriate or legal. Similarly, we don't see a lot of convergence around ideas of hate speech. We don't see a lot of, sort of parallel ideas in the United States, Europe, and Asia, in Latin America around what kinds of speech cross the line from insulting into illegal, into something where we believe the government should actually intervene and restrict what's going on. So since I'm the reason the panel is starting late, which I apologize, I'm not going to take any more time. I'm going to turn things over to our amazing group of 5 panelists. And my hope is that each of them will sort of talk a little bit about the country or the region that they focused on and give us some highlights of what sort of their big takeaways are in that particular country, or in the case of the EU, set of countries, and then talk a little bit about what it is that they see sort of potential for collaboration and convergence with other countries, and where they think the area that they studied really kind of stands alone and is willing to say we want to moderate or censor or treat content in a different way from the United States, from the EU, from Brazil, from China. So we have 5 fantastic panelists. We have Arthur Pericles from the Wikimedia Foundation and also a research scholar at Yale Law School. We have Eric Goldman, who's a professor at Santa Clara University School of Law. Shashank Mohan, who is at the National Law University in Delhi, as well as the Center for Communication Governance. Christoph Busch at the University of Osnabrück, and Yufeng Wang at the Oxford Global Society. And I'm going to invite each of you to sort of speak for 4 or 5 minutes, giving us some introductory thoughts on the country or the region you studied, and then we'll open it up for a little discussion and back and forth. So Eric, I'm going to come to you first to tell us a little bit about the United States.
Just checking if you can hear me okay. I was having a little difficulty unmuting. Greetings everyone from California. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person with you to enjoy this conference. I wrote a paper as part of this project describing the state of play in the United States. And as most of you know, the United States has 2 different levels of protection for speech in our country. First, we have constitutional protections codified in the First Amendment, which guarantees the right to free speech and free press from government interference. And then we have a statutory protection, Section 230, that basically says that websites aren't liable for third-party content. And it's this double-barreled protection for publisher discretion that has enabled services to basically set their own policies. Some services have adopted fairly restricted policies towards user-generated content. They control relatively tightly what kind of content they want to their audience to consume, while other services have adopted fairly liberal policies where they basically let most kinds of content through unless there's some legal prohibition against that content. So we see a greater diversity of user-generated content services and approaches to content moderation here in the US than we're likely to see in other parts of the world because of this double-layered protection from the Constitution and from Section 230. There are other rules for content that aren't covered by the Constitution or Section 230. And the paper tries to explain some of the details, some of the complexities when we get outside of the zone of protection for those two different doctrines. All of the things that are that I just discussed are very much in play here in the United States. We're likely to have 4 Supreme Court decisions on these topics coming up in the 2022-2023 term. So by June of 2023, it's possible that we will have 4 new Supreme Court decisions addressing free speech online. And this creates a dangerous or fraught environment because now the Supreme Court could make some pronouncements that very much shake up how we think about free speech online and might be difficult or functionally impossible for any legislature to navigate around. In the paper, I described things with a relatively cut and dried approach, but at the end, I explained that everything is in play. We are seeing, a frontier of innovation and policymaking. Much of it, in my opinion, actually quite dangerous and disconcerting, but nevertheless innovative. That is going to cast a potentially entirely new perspective on how the U.S. handles user-generated content online. What that could mean is that, in fact, to the extent that the US is an outlier in terms of enabling more free speech in other countries, we might smooth out that discretion. It might become that actually we're no longer a salient, but become closer to the average. It is even possible that we're going to become below average. What the answers are going to be in June of 2023 could be very different than where we are today. So my apologies for being as vague as that, but I think that is the true state of play. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. Chufeng, I want to come to you to tell us a little bit about sort of how you view some of these same dynamics in China and what the important inflection points are there. Hold on, I think we're still moving. There we go, go ahead.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's a great opportunity to participate in this comparative study. Regarding China's approach to platform governance, I'm going to just focus on 3 aspects. So first, regarding platform content liability, the Chinese platforms are explicitly required by government regulators to take primary responsibilities in content governance. They are required to monitor, moderate, and censor content according to government requirements. Yeah, of course, they also do so according to their own content guidelines. So the Chinese approach has been categorized as strict liability compared to the United States, broad immunity, and the EU's and many other countries' conditional liability. So it is true that Chinese platforms are strictly liable to government regulators in content areas such as politically sensitive content. But I want to point out that Chinese platforms also enjoy conditional immunity in terms of tort damages to their users. So as long as platforms take down concerned content upon notices, so they are not liable for the damages caused by the user-generated content. The second point is I want to point it out that public opinion management has always been the fundamental rationale behind the Chinese content governance. I think so to understand this point is important because all regulations in China regarding platforms concerns this kind of rationale. So this is why China exerts stricter rules over platforms that host like news content about public affairs, because such content is considered to have the potential to influence public opinion or the capacity for social mobilization. And such platforms, of course, including social media platforms, they need to apply for a special Internet News Information Service license. And they also need to conduct security evaluation, which is similar to the risk evaluation required by the EU's DSA for very large platforms. And third, so regarding enforcement of platform governance, so while China's civil and criminal laws do apply to Chinese platforms, but the main method of enforcement is administrative measures. Such measures include like campaigns targeting certain types of content, such as obscene, pornography, and vulgar content. And Chinese platform executives are also frequently summoned by China's online content regulators and ordered to deal with so problematic content. So platforms are often issued fines, ordered to suspend their content updates, or their apps can be removed from app stores. So in an extreme case, a platform was ordered to be permanently closed due to like hosting too much like vulgar content. And unlike Western platforms, sometimes, like especially in the EU, they have been issued just very heavy fines. But in China, normally the fines are quite small. But the platforms seldom appear for all this kind of punishment. Yes, sorry for that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so which shows kind of a symmetrical power relations between the governments and the platforms. I think this is also very different from other jurisdictions, because we always talk like very powerful platforms, but in China, the platforms might be powerful in the sense of like market power. They do enjoy like powerful like a dominant market status, but just not politically, they are not that powerful. So that's why the Chinese platforms are quite obedient. So regarding China's approach to platform content governance, I'll stop there. So I'm very interested in hearing other speakers.
Thank you so much. So you alluded several times to the EU approach. So I'm going to come to Chris now. Tell us a little more about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel and to add a European perspective to the debate. As you know, the European Union has just updated its legal framework for platform regulation. The Digital Services Act was published just roughly 4 weeks ago in the official journal, and part of it will become applicable in 2023 and the whole package in February 2024. So we are at a crucial point here where the framework is being updated, but we still don't know how the new rules will play out in practice. So it's a huge experiment, you might say, that the EU is entering into. And I would say, if you ask what are key elements of the DSA that might feed into a global debate on platform regulation in general and content moderation in particular, I would say there are 3 elements. First, the DSA is built on what can be called a risk-based approach or asymmetric approach. It's not a one-size-fits-all regime with one set of rules for all types and all sizes of online intermediaries, but let's say a system that distinguishes between different categories of online intermediaries and that imposes due diligence obligations that increase with the size and the reach, or you might say the social relevance of online intermediaries. That's maybe the first, let's say, architectural feature of the DSA, the asymmetric approach. The second characteristic, I would say, is a focus on transparency and due process, or you might say procedural approach to platform regulation. Most of the rules in the DSA are about transparency, transparency regarding content moderation policies. There are numerous and very detailed reporting requirements. Also, these are differentiated according to the size and reach of the platform. There are transparency requirements regarding recommender systems, algorithmic processes, so amplification features. I think that's a key element. The DSA does not say what type of content is illegal. It leaves this mainly to member states and in part to other areas of EU regulation. It mainly focuses on how platforms shall deal with illegal content or content that is contrary to their community guidelines. So that's the second element. Focus on transparency and due process. And the third element, that is this specific set of rules for very large online platforms. And here you see a regulatory approach that that can be described as a sort of a system perspective or systemic regulation, because here it's no longer about individual tweets or videos or comments. It's how platforms deal with problematic content on a systemic level. That's why the DSA requires VLOPs, the very large online platforms, to conduct a risk assessment, to propose risk mitigation plans, to have an external auditing, to set up a compliance officer. If you look at this, this looks like regulation of financial services industry or other regulated industry. So in a sense, the DSA turns very large online platforms into a regulated industry. Whether that works remains to be seen, but I think it's interesting to see that here, I think Evelyn Dueck wrote about the systems perspective on content moderation, or the content moderation as mass administration of speech. I think this is the very approach that the DSA is taking on very large platforms.
Thank you so much. Shashank, I'm going to come to you now. Tell us a little bit about the landscape in India.
Thank you, Professor Wolf. And I would just like to say that India has also recently added rules to its platform governance regulations. And just to add to what Professor Christoph was saying, that even India now has specific rules for large platforms. They call them significant social media intermediaries, and they define as sort of any platform that has 5 million users. And unlike the DSA, we don't mention monthly active users or active users. And I think what companies, how they are interpreting this number is sort of registered users. So, a large number of platforms may get covered there. So quickly to give a glimpse of the Indian situation as well, the Constitution guarantees freedom of expression, both online and offline, and platforms have conditional immunity. One peculiar, may not be, but one peculiar sort of situation in India is that the Indian government increasingly is wanting to regulate platform speech, and they're doing that under intermediary liability law. Now, the tricky bit with that is that in certain situations, the determination of losing of immunity / safe harbor is determined on a case-to-case basis, on a content-to-content basis by courts. That in certain situations may not incentivize platforms enough to toe the line. So that's a sort of unique situation that India's platform regulation is at right now. So basically, how the government currently is regulating platforms is adding conditions after conditions for platforms to attain immunity for third-party content. Interestingly, India is looking at the world, at every country, and seeing what works for them. So, for example, some of the good things that are coming out is more transparency reporting, although there is some criticism of just them being numbers, but it's a good start. But the unfortunate situation is that we are seeing regulation with the right intent to curb harms on platforms, and especially in countries like India that have nuance and context in their society, which increasingly scholars feel platforms ignore in favor of the global north. They don't spend enough effort into the content moderation efforts in the global south and countries like India. So the government intent may be directed at the right sort of path, but what we see is often those recommendations like pressurizing companies to take off more and more content, adding sort of asking for proactive monitoring for certain types of content, asking for traceability on encrypted applications, and so on, really will end up, we feel, chilling freedom of expression of users. So the challenge we're seeing in India is that the government is coming at it at the right intention, and we need to find solutions for harms online. But the kind of, I would say, unfortunate regulation we're seeing will definitely lead to more user speech and privacy harms than sort of, the intention maybe to protect against. Well, yeah, I mean, I sort of stop there. And let other panelists contribute, and I'd love to I have some notes on sort of the global consensus part of the conversation, because I feel we can add some value there. So I'll give it back to you, Professor Wolf.
Fantastic. Come back to talk about consensus. But first, I want to come to Art and tell us a little about the research you've been doing.
Thank you so much, Professor Wolf. I want to thank everyone with the Digital Planet, Arpita, Dominic, and Professor Joel Trackman. This is a wonderful project. I'm excited to be part of it. My own paper is very loyally in a bad way, not that creative, but I'll try to be more creative in my comments right now. So, hailing from Brazil, I want to give you the overview of platform responsibility in Brazil, and the centerpiece is Marco Civil da Internet, which is, well, it provides safe harbor for platforms for content that's deemed harmful by courts. So platforms are not liable for that content except if they fail to comply with a specific court order. But that doesn't mean we have CDA 230, and I'll tell you why. Well, in a couple ways we don't have CDA 230. First of all, platforms can and have answer for taking down content before the courts under many versions of horizontal effects of fundamental rights theory we have in Brazil. So that's the first difference. And the second difference is that the second difference is, well, sorry, I told you that they can be made liable. And sorry. And the second difference is they can't be obliged to take down content directly through courts, which is something that contrasts with the US approach on this as well. Now, I've told you that the Marco Civil is centerpiece. It isn't the only legislation. It doesn't encompass criminal law, and it doesn't encompass electoral law, which is another domains of the law as well, but electoral law being the most important right now, with Brazil coming out of an election. Electoral law for a while was interpreted in a way that kind of put it apart from Marco Civil regulation, and in 2017, regulation issued by the High Electoral Court, which has both adjudicatory and a regulatory and also administrative authority over the elections. Regulation issued by that court brought the electoral regulation closer to what Marco Civil has. But that still leaves open a lot of room for courts to basically mandate platforms to take down content, and they've been doing this piecemeal mostly. But for the last elections, we've seen a movement where the High Electoral Court started basically creating a way where this wouldn't be piecemeal. And this can be said to be consistent with democracy view if you think that the only thing the democracy view strikes out is making platforms liable for not taking down content. If you issue an order, a court order to that platform, and then it fails to comply with that order, then democracy view doesn't have anything to say about it. Maybe the Constitution does, maybe other laws do, but democracy view itself, under this narrow interpretation, doesn't. I also want to say that there's a question about there's a jurisdictional question, and I think this gets the conversation more global. There's a jurisdictional question as to when Brazilian legislation kicks in, and it isn't clear right now. That's my interpretation. Well, the courts have diverged in this, so I think it isn't clear. Telegram, the app, was on the brink of being blocked in Brazil on one interpretation where the whole of Brazilian legislation would apply to anyone, any platform doing business in Brazil. But it isn't clear that it's the whole of the Brazilian legislation that applies, or under democracy view, or if it's just data protection provisions of democracy view that apply. This is also an interesting question now. With you might have heard of the fake news bill. It isn't actually just about fake news. It doesn't define what fake news is, but the idea is creating a more healthier public sphere on the internet. And there are a number of transparency provisions on that, both for social media and for messaging services. And one important question there is the question about when that new legislation, pending legislation, would kick in. It's also defined in terms of users, but there are a number of obligations on the Brazilian legislation, and it isn't clear that all of them would apply directly. So that's an open question. But I see I'm at 5 minutes. I'll just say something. You asked us about opportunities for cooperation, and I think you basically have everyone on the bricks right now except the R. So here's what I could say on the room. So here's what I could say. I think that there are two paths that maybe are not so obvious that we could look into. The first one would be basically supporting research and supporting development of, for instance, let's say automated tools for content moderation. That's something that if you're at the same time asking companies or platforms to be more responsible, and you're holding them to the standards that they have because they have access to better automated tools, then maybe you should be thinking about incentivizing and maybe supporting research on automated tools, so that people in your own countries can compete or can develop. Doesn't have to be a competition on social media. And my second point would be, and this is the last thing I'll say about the fake news bill. So fake news bill has an interesting provision, and since we're discussing misinformation and disinformation, it has an interesting provision about accounts, social media accounts of public interest. And this, well, what counts as public interest is not exhaustively defined on the bill, but it would include the head of state, it would include members of Congress, it would include everyone who we think we have a right to hear from when they're speaking on social media. Obviously, this is tracking the Knight First Amendment Institute v. Trump case. But beyond that, it has this provision where there's specific protections for those accounts, but there's also the reverse side. So the reverse side is that those accounts are expected, because they have protections being accounts on the public interest, they're also expected to use the social media in keeping with their public interest obligations. So they're expected to abide by the rules that apply to the government in general. And I think that might be an interesting conversation as we discuss globally about how a small number of bad actors coming from the top might be derailing the entire landscape of social media. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. So before we go to questions from the audience, I just want to do one more lightning round with all five of you. And I want you to tell me two things. I want you to tell me, sort of having heard from all of each other, what is the thing about platform governance that you think the US and China and the EU and Brazil and India might all be able to work together and cooperate on? And what is the one thing that's sort of from where you sit, it's just absolutely impossible, never going to happen, there's always going to be really deep disagreement? And this could be an issue, right? This could be, I don't think we're ever going to agree on political speech, or it could also be an approach, right? As Arthur was just talking about, I think we could all agree on maybe more automated moderation tools or something like that. So it could sort of span any piece of that. But I'm curious, as you sort of react to each other's research, where do you see real hope and where do you see really no hope at all? And Eric, I'm going to come back to you first.
You might not have wanted to put me first, because I see no hope here, actually. I see only dystopia. And what I mean by that is the term platform governance itself is a code word for government censorship. What we are really talking about is if we took it, drew a pie of who controls speech online, there's going to be an allocation that goes to the government, an allocation that goes to the private sector. And what we're seeing is that that pie is shifting so that the private sector discretion is shrinking and the government sector pie wedge is increasing, and eventually might functionally usurp or eliminate even any private discretion whatsoever. We call that censorship. And that's the part that troubles me about everything I'm hearing from my co-panelists. What they're describing in their country is the government is winning at controlling speech online. And what's worse to me is so many people are cheering that and saying that's good news, when what I hear is that is the end of what I consider to be free speech. That is the triumph of government censorship. So I'm sorry, I'm actually not answering your question, but you see, to me, it's the wrong question. The question is, will we have what we consider to be free speech online? And I believe the answer is increasingly no.
Thank you. Dufang, what are you thinking?
So if I speak from the perspective of China alone, the answer is also very pessimistic, because China is very unique in the platform ecosystem. Even the platforms dominant in China, just very different from others, so-called global platforms. So I don't think if there is kind of like global approach, I don't think China will be part of it. But having listened to Professor Christoph Bull, yeah. So I think the EU's DSA does provide some hope in that approach. For example, because the DSA focuses on like procedural issues rather than just defining what is illegal content, what are illegal content or harmful content. I think that's a very useful approach, because we all know that different countries, we have different legislations and also different social, political, and also cultural factors. So it is impossible, in my view, to reach an agreement regarding the just specific, like policies about how to regulate those the platforms. What to define illegal content, that's impossible. But if we leave that just aside, I think just defines the obligations of platforms. And then in that approach, it's possible to reach some consensus on the basic principles for maybe not all countries, maybe still excluding China, maybe. Yeah, and at least I think maybe like-minded countries. This is a very popular word in Europe, in the US. So a lot of things now just working on the basis of like-minded countries. So if not really a global approach, so maybe some cooperation between those countries that could be possible. But still, another but, I think maybe the US, I don't know whether the US will agree with the EU's approach, because a lot of obligations will be forced on the US-based companies. So I think the US will be a main factor in that sense.
Thank you. Christoph, anything more optimistic to say?
Yes, indeed. I would say I'm a bit more optimistic than Eric, and I wouldn't talk about triumph of government censorship, but rather setting some rules for private censorship. And I use this term in a rather neutral way, because I see that on private platforms there is some legitimate private censorship, but I would say it is necessary that there is transparency about how content moderation is done, and that there are some procedural safeguards here. And I think this is so. This is what the DSA is about. And indeed, following up on what Yufang has said, I think that this focus on procedural aspects could indeed be a way forward. And actually, if you ask why is the DSA focusing on procedural aspects, I would say the answer is exactly because there is no consensus in the European Union on the substantive limits of free speech online. There are different views on this within the European Union, and this is why the DSA is focusing on these procedural aspects. And I think we could see a similar model on a global focus. I don't see any hope with regard to substantive issues. I think there is too much divergence there. But with regard to procedure, transparency, maybe even these systemic elements of auditing, external auditing standards for external auditing, this could be an area where some, let's say, modular progress could be achieved.
Thank you so much, Shashank. What are you saying?
Thank you so much. I'm in an interesting position to agree with all my co-panelists who went before me. I really personally agree with the sentiment that Professor Eric is bringing, especially being an Indian and looking at the push that the government is having on sort of on making efforts that really impact speech. And the thing is, everything looks good right now, but when critical moments of public engagement in the society happens is when we see governments really use these tools. But I'll also want to sort of agree to Yufang on the point that I want to draw a distinction here and also share with whoever's listening in that the sentiment in India is that platforms are not doing enough. And you know, happy to debate whether that's the right sentiment or not, but I'm just sort of sharing the mood that's in the country. And I'm talking about the government mood, is that platforms are not doing enough, and they're not doing enough in countries like India. They're not understanding local context, they're not understanding cultural nuance, and they're not doing enough. The tricky bit is that there is some truth to that, but as we know, governments sort of extend that notion, and they tend to sort of, you know, the regulations they bring out tend to impact speech. And you know, we at New Delhi are part of you know, two processes. One is the ad hoc committee on cyber crimes, we have an observer status and on the OEWG process for reasonable cybersecurity as well for states. And what we're seeing, and I'm going to just agree with the panelists who went before me, is that to draw consensus will be very difficult. For example, in the Cybercrime Convention conversations, India wants to sort of define and include disinformation within cybercrimes. And the room is extremely divided and tensed on that. And the upcoming conversations, that topic will be taken up. Having said that, we have observed the meetings and we have found that there are certain positions that we can draw consensus on. I've taken the liberty to actually note down some things, and the DSA has made a bit of things difficult for us Indian scholars. I'll tell you why, is because the things we've been telling the government not to do is happening in EU. And now the Indian government is telling us, hey, if Europe is doing it, who are you to tell me not to do it? And that's creating a when it came to GDPR, it was probably good. We don't know. There's questions on the GDPR as well. But when it comes to DSA, we tend to we're a bit skeptical. India's currently going to draft its new DSA-like law. And I feel there's going to be, and the way India copies European regulation is in its own way, which further sort of runs into its own challenges, because the problem is that EU institutions are very robust, they're more mature. I take that liberty to say that, as compared to India, and what may work for the EU might not work for India. For example, the example of trusted flaggers will definitely fail in India. It will lead to mass censorship, as Professor Eric is sounding out. In fact, when we saw the first draft of the DSA in India, I was like, that gave me the sort of nervousness and sweat, because interns were coming up and sort of suggesting, hey, why can't India do this? And I was like, stop. So I'm going to just say something. I looked at the DSA again. There are a couple of things I think that broadly governments want, and I'm going to, again, it's mostly procedural, right? I don't think we can all agree on what disinformation means as countries. Increasingly, and I'm happy to sort of be called out here, but I'm trying to engage with the conversation. Increasingly, what governments want is platforms to uniformly apply their terms of conditions. That's something that we're seeing in India. That's something I feel is a sentiment in Europe also. So that's something that there may be some consensus on. There's obviously transparency, as Professor Christoph was pointing to. Again, I think it may be a good opportunity for people to come together to decide, okay, what is meaningful transparency? Are numbers enough? What do we need transparency on? I think that's a useful conversation to have. There is content like NCII content, which countries agree need to be expeditiously taken off. Now, obviously, there's concern that, are we suggesting you use proactive monitoring? There's concerns of speech there. No, I think it's a voluntary efforts platform should do. I was reading a Bloomberg report on how TikTok and Bumble have actually gone on and sort of agreed to the Stop NCI project that Facebook has. I think that's a good sign. That points to some consensus within private corporations. It might point to some consensus within countries. I don't want to mention the children word, because often using the children's harms is something that we've seen really countries extended to levels that impacts all kinds of speech. So I'm going to be a bit wary of saying that. One thing that is very clear, and going back to what Professor Christoph was saying about large platforms, I think all countries want American large platforms to be more accountable. They have the cash for it. They have the resources for it. I think that's a sentiment that most countries agree. Again, I'm not saying that I could not make errors here. I'm trying to engage with the conversation. So yeah, thanks, Professor.
So much, Ajay. Archer, you sort of already answered this question in your first remarks, but that's a good thing because we only have 2 minutes left. So I just want to come to you for any final thoughts you may have had from listening to your other panelists, or anything you'd like to add.
Thank you. So I think we have that same momentum in Brazil for platform governance regulation, and that's the term most are using in Brazil. platform responsibility, platform accountability. That's happening, and the idea of focusing on process and transparency is there. And I think the idea there is precisely what Christoph alluded to. Well, corporations have been making the decisions by themselves here, and they are not necessarily acting in the public interest. So maybe now we have to make them act in the public interest. And I think that's a valid sentiment and valid goal. What I think is the problem is that if you don't have a clear view on what the limits are, or if you don't have a clear view on what can happen, if you as a platform get it wrong, then there's a lot of room for capture for the regulators to co-opt platforms, and that I think worries me. So I think going back to my earlier comment, one thing that maybe obviously this wouldn't be in the interest of governments themselves, but one thing that maybe states beyond governments could think about is trying to keep each other in check. Because obviously, if I'm the high electoral court, if I'm Congress in Brazil, I think I'm quite legitimate, and I'm not trying to co-opt anyone, and I'm acting in the public interest. But maybe there are blind spots there that get much clearer if you can develop an international standard as to what independent regulators are, and so that you can have guardrails about capture and co-opting of social media platforms.
Thank you so much. I want to first thank all of the panelists very much for participating in this from all over the world. I haven't saved time for questions. That's very much on me. So what I'm going to say is, I think we have a 15-minute break next, and I'm going to invite members of the audience to come up to the podium and speak into this microphone. And if you five can stick around for another few minutes and take some questions sort of during the break, I think that would be fantastic. But before we do that, please join me in thanking all of our panelists for all of their work. Thank you.
I wanted to ask a question. This is Joel Trackman. Thank you so much to panelists for a really revealing analysis in a short period of time. I think I just wanted to comment briefly on the debate between Christoph and Eric, in a sense, and put my own gloss on it, if I may. And I think when we look at these platforms, someone is going to be in charge, whether it's the private sector owner of the platform, like Elon Musk, or a government. And I think we understand that either of those controls could be dangerous because of the value of these platforms. And so I think it's one of these areas in which governments will have to take a role within the bounds, the constitutional and administrative bounds of government action, and make sure that platforms are not engaging in too much of their own censorship. But I wanted to challenge one other aspect of the discussion, and that is the preference for process regulation. I think one of the problems in this area is the question of whether you're focusing on process and platform process responsibilities versus substantive law. And it's definitely true that when we speak about the DSA, the clear principle is that it doesn't address diversity of substantive law in a variety of areas. But I'm suspicious, as maybe Eric is, of the DSA and of the possibility that the due diligence obligations that it imposes will be applied as a subtle form of government regulation of speech, as a form of substantive regulation. So the line between process and substance in this area, I think, is not so very clear. And so I think this problem of censorship by government versus censorship by the private sector, it will always be with us. And I think that different countries, different jurisdictions will do this differently. And I go back to Josephine's point and a point that you all are well aware of, that in some areas, like child sex material, it will be easier to agree, and in other areas it will be tougher to agree. And in those areas where it's tougher to agree, it seems to me that in order for the world to be orderly, there have to be rules about allocation of jurisdiction over certain kinds of conduct. So that's I apologize for the length of that intervention. Maybe there are other people who want to ask questions, and I'll be a moderator now, but if anyone wants to address those points, I'd appreciate it. Eric
has a question.
Thanks. We can't unmute ourselves, so we can only speak up when we're given the permission. And there might be a metaphor about this entire process of substantive and procedural regulation when I can't even speak up when I'm called on. I just want to reinforce, and I did drop a note in the chat about your excellent point about whether or not there's really meaningful differences between substantive regulation or control of online speech and procedural regulations of online speech. To me, there really is no difference. And what I ask anyone who thinks there could be a difference is to think not about what the rule says, but about who will enforce those procedural obligations, what their motivations are, and how they could use those tools to engage in pressuring services to do what they want them to do, like censorship. So it's not about the tools, it's about the enforcement of those tools. And I think that the enforcement piece gets forgotten. It just gets ignored. Like, oh, I assume that it'll be enforced in only legitimate ways. And we have plenty of evidence that that's just not true.
The question from David Kepler at the AP. You
Yes,
are
hello, thank
unmuted.
you so much for having us and for doing this today. It's extremely insightful. Elon Musk was mentioned, and I'm curious if the disarray we've seen at Twitter since the new ownership says anything about the need for the transparency and consistency that you all have been speaking about. And I'm also curious, we've seen indications that under the new ownership, Twitter has made some different decisions in different parts of the world and may be taking moderation more seriously in the United States than it is in other nations. And I'm wondering if you all have anything to say about that, and if that is something you've seen in your research as well. Thank you.
Would anyone from the panel like to take that on? Eric, go ahead. Me unmute.
Sorry, I don't mean to go to the front of the queue, so let me just keep it brief. I think that what Musk is doing with Twitter is completely permissible under US law. He has the discretion as the owner of a service to decide what he thinks is fit to his audience. What we don't know is whether or not that needs to be solely controlled by the government or if there will be marketplace disciplining functions. For example, we've seen half of his top advertiser base has left Twitter. And so until we see how his experiment plays out, I think we don't really know yet whether or not government control is the only solution to any problems he's creating. Thank you.
Josh.
I just wanted to chip in and sort of just go back to talking about how we were mentioning uniformity of application of terms of conditions by platforms. I think I want to mention, and I sort of alluded to this in my comments, is that in India, at least, governments are giving themselves tools. What they're smartly doing is not enforcing them on a regular basis. What happens is when it makes quote unquote, and I go out on a leg to say this, quote unquote political sense for government, when it's favoring their political sort of notions, they bring out these tools of the powers of sort of censorship online, the powers of traceability on WhatsApp and encrypted platforms. And we see that when public mood is going against the government, they pull out these tools and sort of apply. So just adding to some of the conversation that when we talk about these procedural sort of regulations that are coming in for platforms, platform governance, they are not without risks. And I just wanted to add a bit of context to, let's say, a country like India and what we face here. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions?
There's, I
Sorry,
apologize.
Christoph wants-
Chris, go ahead.
We,
I wanted just to very briefly add to the a comment by Eric that there might be a gray area between procedural regulation and more substantive regulation. And yes, indeed, there are elements also in the DSA that might be well abused in a sense. There is, for example, in the article about a transparency regarding a content moderation, a requirement that platforms shall act in a diligent, objective, and proportionate manner in applying their content moderation policy, and that there shall be due regard to fundamental rights. And this is, of course, more than just procedure. There are a lot of, let's say, heavy substantive concepts referred to here, and there I think everything depends on whether these tools are used diligently by courts and by an enforcement authority. Here very much depends on the institutional setting. So you cannot separate the rules from the institutional setting in which they live, in which they are applied. So that's and regarding Twitter, I think that's from a European perspective, that's highly problematic what is happening there, not because of the DSA, which is not yet applicable, but because of a different set of rule, and that is the Code of Practice on Disinformation, a self-regulatory framework that just got updated and to which Twitter is a signatory. And this Code of Practice requires the signatories to act against fake accounts, bot-driven amplification, to demonetize disinformation by making sure that advertising is not linked to disinformation content. And I'm not sure whether Twitter is doing its job there.
Thank you.
There's one comment and question from the chat, and then I think we'll probably end there so folks can wrap up and get some coffee, virtual or otherwise. I believe this is from Howe, who asks, to talk a little bit about the commercial incentive and specifically how that impacts the social platforms. Apologies here. Everything's gone a little haywire. Yeah, so just what is the impact of, the profit motive on the regulation of content, especially when certain political parties and different groups embark on sponsored campaigns? So how does that regulation of content and accountability of platform owners fit in here? So I'll turn that over to the panel.
Thank you. Go ahead, Eric.
Sorry, I really don't prefer to be at the front of the queue, but I'll just point out, over the course of media history, almost every publisher has been for profit. Some of them have been selling units directly to consumers. Some of them have been engaged in subscription models. Many of them have been ad supported. The fact that internet services are also then going to be commercialized in one of those business models really isn't unusual. So whatever concerns we might have about that would apply to media history for centuries.
One thing that I think we know is that platforms make more money from advertising when they publish more contentious or lurid content. And so there is that tendency. I don't know if that's something that can be regulated in a way that would counter that and how we would feel about that. That's, I think, the question about government intervention, when it can be beneficial. I think one of the things that Shashank mentioned is worth underlining. That is the externality that comes from allocation of moderation resources and the fact that they might be limited in some places. And some governments, through their regulation and through the value of their markets, might take a disproportionate amount of the moderation resources. But there's also the fact that, as the panel has suggested, it may be that one country is less concerned about election integrity in another country, and so there's lots of room for harmful externalities of various kinds. So with that, please join me in thanking the panel and take a coffee break.
This gives us an opportunity to hear from the platforms themselves, also to hear from stakeholders who work alongside platforms and potentially work outside the platforms and try to keep them honest. And those stakeholders could include fact-checking groups, or they could include the media. So it gives me and my dear colleague Joel Trackman a great pleasure to welcome a terrific group here to have a conversation, not just about the problem, but about how we go about solving for the problem of digital disinformation and its potential spread in different parts of the world. Let me just hand this over to Professor Trackman for a couple of opening comments, but let me make one observation, which is what really got me personally extremely engaged in this larger question of how do we manage the spread of disinformation globally. And this has to do with something that I call the misinformation paradox. The paradox being the following, that if you have regulators in different parts of the world putting regulations in place that force platforms to moderate the content on their systems, then the platforms are forced to respond to the regulators by allocating resources that manage content, that moderate content in the jurisdictions where the regulations are the strictest. So if I'm a platform like Meta or YouTube, I shall leave Twitter out of this picture because there's much more to that story. So if I'm any one of these platforms, I have a limited amount of resources to allocate to moderate content. Those resources could be algorithmic, they could be human. And where do I put those resources? The natural response would be a response of where does the regulation pinch the hardest, and where is the commercial challenge, the commercial risk, where does that pinch the hardest? So you might end up with a bit of, not a bit of, but potentially a gigantic problem, which is the content moderation resources get directed towards countries and jurisdictions where the policymakers and regulators shout the loudest and have the most strict regulations, and where the commercial opportunities are the greatest, and parts of the world which have neither could get starved content moderation resources, and you end up with bad content disproportionately showing up in parts of the world that do not have such pressures in place. And that creates an extremely lopsided world where you might have countries like Sri Lanka, countries like Myanmar, countries like Nigeria, Kenya, where either the commercial opportunities or the regulatory opportunities are weak, and disinformation flowing freely there. So how do we manage this problem at the global level? Coming at it from multiple stakeholders is the subject of this panel's discussion. And with that very long introduction, Joel Trackman.
Thank you, Oscar, for setting the stage. Let me continue to set it a bit by speaking about what's unique at this moment, and then asking our panelists. We've got a wonderful group of people with different perspectives, but also quite expert perspectives in this area to, say what they think is the route to a solution. So it's a challenging question, but maybe first I can say a little bit about the problem, and they can redefine the problem and then suggest what they think might be solutions. So the problem is in this increasing velocity and intensity of interaction that makes, this is my frame, obviously, that makes traditional rules about allocation of authority no longer efficient to allocate resources, to determine who's in control of different things. And it arises because these platforms are so active, but also because they're relatively global. And this raises the question of whether geo-blocking or some technical solution can allow the recreation of borders in this area, and whether that would be a good thing. I'd like very much to hear from the panel about that possibility and the benefits of that. Another question that might be considered as we move forward is this question of whether there are lowest common denominator areas like child sex abuse, where it may be possible to begin cooperation and learn how to cooperate, recognizing that part of the cooperation in that sense is about substance rather than about process, as we discussed in the prior. Another question, my area of specialty is trade law and regulation, is what is the link between this area and international commerce? And in part, it's this question of whether there will be barriers to platforms, barriers to commerce, based on these differences of regulation in this area. So how do we think about market access conditionality? And I note that the United States in the past has started to negotiate for Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act equivalents with Japan and Canada, maybe other countries, with some modest levels what you might call success. Yet another question, and this is something that maybe has happened in the area of privacy and maybe will happen in other areas, is the effect of European Union rules to drive change in the rest of the world. This Brussels effect that Henry Bradford, a professor at Columbia Law School, has named. To what extent is it that when the European Union adopts the Digital Services Act, it makes sense for other countries to adopt something similar? And then maybe we can speak about the question of whether resources, as Bhaskar has focused on, need to be reallocated to deal with these moderation issues. So with that, Bhaskar, do you want to introduce the panel? And
Sure, fantastic. So we should get right into it, and we have a terrific lineup of experts representing many different critical groups as we start to define the outlines of a solution and maybe just the beginning of the solution, but at least will give us quite a bit to chew on. So we have Anne-Marie Enghoft Larsen, who's the tech ambassador for Denmark. We have Connor Sanchez, who's in content policy and content moderation and meta platforms. We have Naomi Shipman, who is head of data and implementation with the Oversight Board. Cameron Hickey, who is right next to me, and we'll give Cameron this computer right here so that you'll see Cameron head and shoulders shortly. He's the program director for algorithmic transparency at the National Conference on Citizenship. We have Ed Weiss, who is the CEO of Medan, a fact-checking organization. Maybe I've not completely characterized what Medan does. Maybe Ed, you can correct me. And Tiffany Shu, whose byline articles you probably read repeatedly in the New York Times. She has done an enormous amount of work on reporting on misinformation. So with this fantastic lineup, we're really looking forward to this conversation. And what I would suggest is we start with Connor, perhaps giving us a bit of an insider view on how meta platforms goes about content moderation? What are the processes and policies in place? We've heard in the last panel, several panelists kind of saying this is the responsibility of platforms. So what are the platforms doing? And I would ask Naomi to weigh in as well as to how the oversight board works with Meta and what kinds of lessons could we draw, not just for Meta platforms, but for the other digital platforms. So over to you, Connor.
Great. Thank you so much, Bhaskar and Professor Trackman. It's great to be here virtually, and thank you so much for inviting us to participate in this great discussion. My name is Connor Sanchez, and I work at Meta. I'm on the content policy team. Prior to Meta, I worked on technology policy at the World Economic Forum's Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is here in San Francisco, where we focused on building and managing multi-stakeholder communities to co-design policy around the use of emerging tech like AI and machine learning. So I think that speaks to, I think, some of the background that I come from, and I think the position that I take is just the importance of multi-stakeholder, multi-sector collaboration for resolving really tough issues related to this. So to jump right into it, I'm on the content policy team, which is the team that writes the policies for what people are allowed to share on Facebook or Instagram. But specifically, I'm on a sub-team that's called the Stakeholder Engagement Team. And what we do is try to open up the policy development process and gather outside views on our policies. This could mean speaking with safety experts, issue advocacy groups, identity advocacy groups, and human rights defenders. It also includes academics who have deep expertise in a certain area, depending on the policy issue that we're looking at. And so our mission is really to bring together these diverse perspectives from around the world and feed them into our policy development process, whether we're building something new or refining existing policies. And the reason I'm excited to be part of this discussion is really, I believe this is at least part of the equation. I think that anyone who spent time sitting with these issues for a while knows that developing a set of rules for a global community, and one that's as big as the one that Meta Platforms has, is extremely difficult. Defining hate speech in one country is going to be different from defining it in another jurisdiction. And so there are no real easy answers to, I think, a lot of these questions, and they often come with trade-offs and deep trade-offs to consider with risks on both sides. The policies that we have right now are reflected in our community standards, which are at least in part products of the work we've done to engage externally. But it's in no way does this mean that they're perfect or complete. We have plenty of work to do. There are plenty of policy gaps, and I think this is partially, where our team comes in. We think of this as an iterative process that requires constant communication externally to determine whether our policies need to be adjusted, especially as the balance shifts in terms of certain cultural or political trends. And these trends are never stop changing. I think just in the last year, so many big political shifts have asked us to really reflect and look at our policies in big ways. The last 5 to 10 years have been nothing if but extremely significant in terms of change. And I think we can expect that the next 5 to 10 years will be just as profound, if not more so. So I think that's where I think that we always have to be in constant communication externally, and where I'll kind of kick us off and start for today. So thanks again, and looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you, Connor. Naomi.
Great, happy to build on that. Nice to see so many familiar faces. I am the head of the data and implementation team at the Oversight Board. I previously built the academics and researchers program for CrowdTangle and worked with a lot of folks on this call and in this room probably. I'm also a fellow at the Integrity Institute, which is a community of current and former tech integrity workers looking to help develop sort of industry consensus, right, or tech worker consensus around best practices for integrity. So wearing a couple different hats today, but primarily will be representing the oversight board perspective. And so I think, where the board really tries to intersect with Meta's content policy work is to engage sort of from the human rights, international human rights law and digital rights advocacy group perspective to engage with some of these more difficult questions that Connor was raising. And I think a lot of the key challenges here is obviously legitimacy in governance, right? The oversight board tries to counterbalance the perceived sort of, or perceived or real, right? Unilateral decision making that Meta is making about its policies by engaging with users, taking user cases and understanding where those gaps in policies, where users are kind of falling through the cracks. And so I'll say a lot of the oversight board's priorities have been, and where its success has actually been, has been around this concept of user due process, right? And the feeling of, do users understand and feel like the rules are legitimate, basically, for content on Meta's platforms. The oversight board has made the most recommendations and the most successful recommendations around questions of legitimacy and sort of user due process than any other major content area. And that's actually where we've seen the most success as well. So for example, Meta has rolled out, and in its most recent update in its Transparency Center on the oversight board, you can see this, they've rolled out increasingly granular user notifications that share, okay, you violated the hate speech policy, but which subtype, right? How did you violate it? And making sure that users really understand this is exactly the rule that you broke, and trying to be really specific. And Meta has found there to be an increase in user perceptions of legitimacy of the governance process as a result of that increasing specificity. So I think we're seeing sort of the trend of where this is going, right? Of deeper user understanding, deeper user engagement, and again, from an international human rights law and human rights standard perspective. So I'll pause there, but happy to be here and excited for the conversation today.
Naomi, let's see, Ed, perhaps you can share your perspective on how you're seeing this from outside.
Yeah, thanks, Bhaskar, and thanks for the invite to the panel. It's great to be here. So Medan is not a fact-checking org. I'll fact-check your introduction there, unfortunately, Bhaskar. We do work in the fact-checking ecosystem. We develop open source technologies that run some of the largest election monitoring and third-party fact-checking programs in the world. And we've been doing that for 10 years, since before the misinformation industrial complex, as I like to call it, was envisioned, and kind of in the early days of web optimism. I think that the perspective I bring to the conversation is as the leader of an organization that is working in the trenches on fighting disinformation during critical public moments like elections. And I think that I'll just briefly touch on insights from our last two election projects as a way to frame, I think, the scope of the challenge and the complexity of it. So we worked with Maria Ressa and her team and a network of 130 media and civil society partners in an unbelievably rigorous effort to address misinformation in the run-up and through the Philippines election this spring. It was an inspired effort. Maria won the Nobel Peace Prize in the middle of our the development of that effort. So, it was well funded, well supported, and well staffed. And the outcome of that election was a landslide victory that was in part premised on a complete revision of the historic memory of the Marcos regime and Marcos Sr. regime, and dominant narratives that included widespread belief that a untapped and unimaginably large repository of gold would be released on successful election of Marcos. So this is not democracy. This is not democracy when an electorate goes to the polls voting on an understanding of the world that is the intentional and malicious disinformation campaign in full bloom. So we had an incredible effort. Ironically, won impact awards for that project, and did not scratch the surface on the real depth of the challenge. So one example, Philippines. Fast forward, Brazil. We worked with 6 of the leading media organizations in Brazil, and we worked with the TSE, which is the government authority in Brazil responsible for conducting the elections and monitoring the elections. They embraced misinformation as an election integrity issue and used our software to create a WhatsApp tip line that fielded hundreds of thousands of requests from Brazilian citizens and distributed more than 140,000 fact checks that then went into the WhatsApp ecosystem and were spread around. So, and that election was decided by a very thin margin. We think that the project had actual real world impact. And it was, again, a heroic effort. I put those 2 examples forward to share kind of what it means to be doing this work in the world, the stakes of ecosystems, of media and information ecosystems that are gamed and that are not reflecting an honest view of the world or of a political candidate's position, and I think we have a million miles to go. So look forward to the discussion. I do think the moment in history with what's happened at Twitter does recommend that we think about radically different solutions. We think differently about how data is shared between platforms, but I hope we'll get into that in the discussion. But yeah, maybe a little lengthy in my opening remarks there, so I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you for fact checking me. Much needed. Cameron, as you listen to all this, what are your reactions? And could you say a little bit about what your organization does?
Sure. So my name is Cameron Hickey. I run the Algorithmic Transparency Institute, which is a research project that lives in a larger nonprofit called the National Conference on Citizenship. We do 2 things primarily. We build infrastructure that empowers journalists, academic researchers, and civil society organizations to understand what's happening on social media. And we run programs that train and mobilize folks to try and tackle those problems. Not necessarily to solve the problem of misinformation itself, but to build resilience to it so that the impact of it are lessened. I kind of want to pick up where Ed left off, because he just gave us 2 different elections and those outcomes, but everyone in this room and on this panel knows we just had another big election. And I think one of the concerns that we had going into it, and that many people across this country had, was that the 2022 midterms had a lot of risks, right? We were concerned about what happened in 2016, 2018, and certainly in 2020, and whether or not we were going to see a repeat of those things or expansion. In the end, it feels like we saw something different. And I think that what we saw that was different was that very few political actors continued to perpetuate the big lie, for example, or to continue to promote concerns about election fraud and other forms of mis and disinformation that were clearly present throughout the campaign. And so why was there a difference? And I think the efforts that Ed spoke to that happened in other places also were mirrored here in the United States, both by civil society and by journalists in particular. And we saw a mobilization of people. We saw a mobilization of people who have learned some of the lessons from the last 6 years and operationalized potential ways to mitigate for some of the worst harms. What we've done is specifically focused on civil society organizations and mobilizing them to directly take action. So training folks on the ground to look for and identify problematic content, training folks to report that content back up through their own communications apparatus and directly to platforms in order to get action taken and to educate folks on the ground about how to be more resilient. So the content floated all around 2022, just as it did in 2020, but it had less of an impact because people learned to deal with it. And so I think one of the things that a lot of our work is hooked onto, and we started to develop this in 2020, and then it was really inspired in 2021. In 2021, we got a new administration in the United States. And with that new administration, we got a new Surgeon General. Historically, I think the thing that I always associate with a Surgeon General is that label on the back of cigarettes that tells us these things cause cancer. It's like one of the, since I was a little kid, that's what Surgeon General meant to me, was warning us about something that's very obvious and very dangerous. In 2021, the first big advisory that this administration Surgeon General issued was an advisory on health misinformation. And in that advisory, our Surgeon General said, accomplishing change in addressing mis and disinformation requires a whole of society. It's no longer just an effort by the platforms or the regulators or even the fact checkers. It's all of us working together that's going to actually make a difference. And I think that that's what we actually saw moving forward. And I think that that's where we look for the future to some of those impacts. That doesn't mean that we don't expect more from platforms. And I think that we need to probe a lot more on something that Bhaskar, you said at the very top, which is that there's limited resources for content moderation. Clearly, there is some upper limit. I think how much is being invested and where that limit is are quite far apart. And so there's a question of where the allocation of resources is there. So there's still responsibility on the part of these platforms, but the platforms alone aren't going to solve it. Regulation, up to and including DSA is not going to solve it. Fact checking alone also will not solve it if we aren't also mobilizing society in an effort to combat it.
Thank you, Cameron, for that. And as you said, a lot of this responsibility is shared. It's shared not just by the platforms, but by society at large. And to help civil society get a better handle on the extent of misinformation and where the potential sources are and how to even interpret information that's coming through the various platforms that people spend so much time on. We often go to reliable sources that are, in many ways, define themselves to be the standards for fact, for truth. And can't think of any other standard more renowned than the New York Times for this. So, Tiffany, could you share a bit about how you've seen the discourse on misinformation evolve over the course of your report?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me. I'm part of a pretty sizable team at the Times that focuses on misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and we're never bored. If anything, we're much busier than we've ever been. Most media outlets don't have the resources that we have to cover a topic that really permeates every form of coverage there is. Most other news outlets don't have the research firepower, they don't have the institutional support, and they don't have the collective experience that we're lucky to have at the Times. And that's something that is probably contributing in part to the spread of misinformation, because there are many, many local outlets that aren't able to focus on this type of an issue. What we're seeing out there, there's more misinformation, disinformation. The tenor of it is intensifying. The perpetrators of it are more sophisticated, and they're much more flagrant about spreading lies and conspiracy theories and misleading narratives. This sort of content is increasingly difficult to define, which of course makes it harder to catch and to check. If you take a look at some of my recent stories, it goes into the issue of what is misinformation now. You know, I wrote something a few weeks ago about manipulated media. And so this is anything from a text message that's been crafted on Photoshop to a deep fake. You know, you get into issues of what is satire, what's parody, what's artistic manipulation. Does that count as misinformation? Is that something that should be removed or flagged? I wrote another story a few weeks ago about the growing disinformation defense industry. These are companies like Alethea, Graphica, Medica. There are many, many more companies that are out there helping clients like Fortune 500 companies or nonprofits or government agencies try to crack down on the waves of disinformation that are starting to affect their business and their operations. I mean, there's a lot of demand now because the spread of this sort of information or misinformation is intensifying. To Cameron's point about, you know, what some of the solutions are, I mean, it's a mix. Is it regulation? Is it moderation? Is it media literacy? Is it a mix of these sorts of things? You know, I've had people say, maybe we should start offering financial incentives for telling the truth. Maybe we should just grow thicker skins. It's hard to say, you know, if it's one of these, all of these, none of these. You know, if you're looking at an issue like moderation, this is something that we come across a lot in our reporting, right? Do moderators reflect the diversity of users of say, a social platform? You know, if you don't have a core of moderators who say speak a certain number of languages or who are participants in a certain community, you're not going to be able to catch the nuances that often inflame misinformation. Volume is another issue. There's a flood of content that is tricky. So if you don't have enough people to catch that, you're gonna miss some of it. And then you run into issues of, you know, like the implied truth effect, which basically says that if you try to catch some misinformation, but you don't catch all of it, the stuff that remains up is interpreted as being factual. Anyways, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there that we notice. There's material that's obviously false and can be easily taken down, but really the trickier challenge, I think now, is rooting out the instigators, the repeat offenders, the reasons why no amount of piecemeal moderation is ever going to prevent misinformation from reemerging and morphing and multiplying, which is what it's doing now.
Thank you, Tiffany, for that. And as I was listening to you talk about some of the ways in which the misinformers are getting around filters and blocks, and the need for humans to look at the posts and make judgment calls. I'm also reflecting on the fact that this issue cuts both ways. So if you think about the opposite of misinformation, which is actually having information pierce through the veil of censorship, as it's probably happening right now in many parts of the world, but most prominently currently in China. So you have people who are trying to break through blocks on social media by using all kinds of code, you know, whether it's a banana peel for Xi Jinping or taking videos of videos so that it doesn't get caught by the algorithms that block videos of protest marches across Chinese cities. So it's really interesting to see how these tricks of the misinformation trade can be used for both positive and not so positive purposes. That said, I'd like to come in, kind of to repeat the cliche of last but not least to Anne-Marie to help us get a sense of how you are approaching this question from the government of Denmark itself. And Denmark, of course, is part of a much larger coalition of governments that have come together to define a set of regulations and laws. And do you see a model for governmental cooperation, regulatory cooperation, as obviously another major stakeholder in this story of how we capture and catch and deplatform misinformation?
Well, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to join here today, and thank you to my co-panelists for some really interesting perspectives. I think the short answer is yes, certainly. Governments have a very large and very significant role to play in this, and we've been used to regulating things that were somewhat physical and within our jurisdictions, and all of a sudden, we're dealing with technologies that do not sort of respect borders and are transnational in nature and are not a single service, but they encompass so much from our information infrastructure, the medium from which Danish people are communicating, how we get our news, how we understand the world, how we are forming perspectives on policy, how we are engaging in our social groups, how we are amplifying maybe aspects of our social beings. So all that is to say, while there might be lessons for how we did things in the 20th century, we are dealing with something that's quite new and unique. And so that's part of the reason why Denmark appointed a tech ambassador. It was exactly to the point that, look, first of all, we need to know more about technology to be able to adequately govern it, regulate it. And I think it's important to say here, governments have always been regulating industries, not to slow down progress, not to make it cumbersome to do growth opportunities and create products and services, but to say that, what are the fundamental rules of the world? That is the prerogative of governments. And the day we stop doing that, governments are doing a really poor job. So that's one. And two, when it comes to, so now the medium is different. The platforms are unprecedented. The influence and the reach and the systemic impact it has on all aspects of our society is something that we haven't seen before. But this question around freedom of speech, I mean, the role of democratic governments have always been to ensure individuals to have the highest amount of freedom, choice, of opportunity, empowering individuals. And part of that responsibility is also saying everything is not possible. We are, dedicated to protecting minors. We are dedicated to protecting marginalized communities. Europe has seen firsthand what happens when the demeanor of an individual group, the pursuit of, based on ideology, what can happen. I mean, the European Union is an outcome of a major tragedy, a European tragedy that still, even now we're 7 decades ago, are the backdrop from which we understand the European Union, our role, our values as Europeans, and what we fight for as democracies. And so all that is to say, I think it's important that we don't fall down the rabbit hole of, if you do anything regulatory, you will infringe free speech. No, there are lots of human rights that we need to balance about whole together. And that is a role of governments in collaboration with citizens. That being said, I think that there's just 2 other points before maybe going more into the discussion. I want to say, yes, this is super challenging. The Digital Services Act is the first attempt from the European Union to address some of the challenges we're seeing with harmful and illegal content. And I think we can all agree the illegal content, no one really wants terrorism material online. No one wants to see child pornography. I think it's almost across the board. We're very, in agreement, the legal content, let's get it off as fast as possible. The problem is around harmful content, and especially sort of harmful content that is, to some individuals creating this internet dumpster fire that becomes very unpleasant being part of. And so we spend so much time in front of our little screens, and what used to be cats and dogs videos and pictures of my son has now sort of turned into polarizing material that is making us all a bit more frustrated and angry and not necessarily understanding each other more. So I think there's an interesting focus on, if we think that this is the best we could do on social media, that this was the height of our innovation, I think we are losing out. what are the new types of platforms that are taking, and I think it's both existing platforms, it's new platforms that are developing business models where content moderation is seen as an income resource. We're making good content moderation, making healthier experiences, more fun experiences being online, doing it with, there are some platforms making it very entertaining, but I think we can discuss sort of privacy and data protection on some of those. So how do we sort of heighten across the board and make it into a thriving business model? I think that's one. And until we get there, just I think a quick point. Yes, content moderation is expensive, and we need to think about how we're treating the people that see the worst of the internet with it as their daily jobs. That being said, I think it's fair to say here, and I mean, Meta had a 100 billion profit last year. YouTube had a 30 billion ad revenue. I live in Silicon Valley. It's not because there's not money. Content moderation, yes, it's a question about resources. And I think it's a question about staffing that adequately and making sure the point in the beginning, it's not only done where people yell the loudest. We saw what happened in Myanmar when there might not be someone advocating for more content moderation, but what happened when that's not there. I think it's also important to say that in that we're seeing a change. I find more and more of the tech companies, I think Oversight Board is a great example, taking this much more serious, trying to find nuanced answers to complex problems. We are seeing an uptake in a lot of this, not least also due to some of the amazing work that the civil society organizations on this panel and the journalists have been advocating for years. And so, I remain somewhat optimistic that this is not, we're in a very positive sort of trajectory to try and tackle some of these things. I find that lawmakers and policymakers, my job is to make them more comfortable and give them confidence that they can actually regulate in this space and doing it in a nuanced way, in a balanced way. So all that to say, I remain somewhat optimistic that this is something that we can solve in due time. Thank you.
Anne-Marie, thank you for your note of optimism. We need quite a bit of that because we started on a bit of a low note in the morning. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Joel Trackman. But before I ask Joel to pose the questions that I'm sure that are buzzing in his mind and in others, let me give Connor the chance to respond to anything he's heard so far, because Connor, you're in the hot seat, my friend.
Yeah, thank you, Bhaskar, and thanks everybody for your great insights. I think I'll just sort of respond on two levels. I think one is I think it was Tiffany made the point about focusing on actors and not the content, or as that being an approach to misinformation. I definitely think that's a direction that I think is worth really looking at more as we look at ways of trying to tackle problematic content. It often turns into a sort of whack-a-mole problem. And so trying to get smarter about this is something that we're definitely hearing and want to look at. So looking at sort of going upstream of content in terms of content moderation and not just solely dealing with the downstream effects. I think that's definitely something that our actor and behavioral policy team is looking at, and I think is what a lot of researchers that I've seen lately, they've been focused on. The other point that I wanted to make was around content moderation and sort of the lack of, there are only so many resources to sort of throw at content moderators, and I definitely think that is an area that we continually need to get better at. I can just say that we need more languages spoken. We're at 70 languages, but it needs to go higher. We need to constantly fill gaps in that area. As a Spanish speaker, I think that I want to see more content moderated in Spanish, just to see that and the effects that has on an electorate. But I also think there are other areas as well. There's creating channels for meaningful and direct engagement with relevant stakeholders. And I think that can mean, I think that can build off of two things that we've created. That's our Trusted Partners program. This is a partnership with over 400 NGOs around the world that are humanitarian agencies, that are human rights defenders, that are researchers in more than 110 countries around the globe. And working with this includes organizations like Tech for Peace or Defy Hate Now, to really work with them and have established communication channels with them so that we can stay on top of what are the harmful misinformation trends that they're seeing, particularly in a crisis situation and during conflict situations. So Access Now just co-authored, I think it was last week or even at the beginning of this week, they just co-authored a Declaration of Principles for Content and Platform Governance in Times of Crisis. And I highly recommend looking at this. And one of the principles is to create channels for direct engagement with NGOs. That's something I think that we want to really hone in on and try to focus in on. That's something that we tried to build into our crisis policy protocol, which was published in August of this year. That's something that was actually born out of a recommendation that came from the Oversight Board from the Trump decision. And so that really helped to start to codify, our existing practices and try to bring in new ones so that we can better respond to situations that are novel, that are new, that are, that we haven't seen before, but and present different challenges to our content moderation practices, and may require us to shift and be agile in a way that responds to a local situation. So I think that's another area in terms of, yes, content moderators, but also these channels of communication, which are reflected, I think, in the Access Now report.
Thank you, Connor. Joel, go ahead.
Thank you very much to this really excellent panel, and I feel fortunate to have an opportunity to ask you a question of you. And the question I have in mind really comes from Anne-Marie's comments and also from the earlier panel. The earlier panel focused on the question of responsibilities of platforms per se. And I think when we begin to speak about election integrity as an example of this kind of issue, we can recognize that it's not just platforms that are the responsible persons, and that it's a whole of society issue and a very important one, but one which would have different dynamics in different societies. So I want to ask what I think of as the subsidiarity question. It's a whole of society problem to have election integrity, but where do we best allocate responsibility to fix the problem of election integrity? So we could start with private sector autonomous action, self-regulation. That's what I take it Connor and Naomi are involved in. We begin with that, and then we have the possibility that different private sector actors could get together and set private standards in this area and try to apply those. We have NGOs as another group that could be involved in this and could supplement the work of the private sector. And then we have national governments, and national governments can regulate, but they run into First Amendment issues, political difficulty, and it's not easy. But what's even harder is the fact that I think different countries have different perspectives on election integrity and may well want to disrupt elections in other countries. So it becomes something like a cybersecurity problem. How do we agree to prevent attacks? And so then the last subsidiarity level is, to what extent is it useful to have international cooperation in this area? So my basic question is, if you were designing an overall subsidiarity-based system for dealing with election integrity, where would you allocate the different components of responsibility? Like to begin? Tiffany, please.
I can hop into this. when I talk to researchers, a lot of them frame this issue as a defense versus offense question, right? Like, are we trying to prevent misinformation at the source, or are we trying to block it once it emerges? How do we do either of those things? I mean, is this a cultural issue? Is this when I write about TikTok, for example, right? TikTok is known as a platform that draws a lot of young people, and I've talked to young people and looked at a lot of research on how they encounter misinformation on that platform specifically, and a lot of them say that they don't care when they come across misinformation, even if they realize that it is likely not true or is misleading, because they see what they're coming across as entertainment, right? So it could be a cultural problem, right? It could be a literacy issue, right? Many schools don't have the capacity to teach students to recognize misinformation, to properly read what's on the internet. They don't understand the concept of starting on one page and going across the board to lateral read, so to speak. Obviously, a lot of people say it's the platform's responsibility to control what gets posted on their sites. But you could also make the argument that it should be a government thing, and not just in the sense of regulation, right? Like during the elections, to your point, many local jurisdictions had election offices that created misinformation specialist teams, where they hired people to specifically go online and look for rumors that were percolating, or to talk to voters about rumors that they had heard. So really any actor that is a part of the chain of the spread of misinformation probably has a role to play in the solution.
Thank you. Anne-Marie, I wanted to ask you to speak next. I was really glad earlier that you mentioned the question of human rights, or the perspective, as I understood it, of human rights being on both sides of the equation, that there's the right to free speech, but the right to election integrity and other rights that sometimes need to be balanced against free speech. So please go ahead.
Absolutely. And maybe just to start with the election integrity point. I find that the biggest challenge to elections is not what happens in the 3 weeks leading up to it. The sort of slowly undermining of democracy, trust in our institutions, and where election integrity really gets challenged is the 4 or 5 years between. It's when individuals start losing trust in the institutions that govern elections. They start losing trust in the individuals that run in elections, and we start seeing these, that's where a lot of mis and disinformation perceptiveness is created. And so we see, adversarial actors fully taking advantage of that leading up to an election, but the damage was really done in the sort of months and years leading up to that. And the election integrity question, I think it's one of the obvious, it's a multi-stakeholder one. And I think we can ask a lot more, what can we do? There's, taking the recent US election from government, from CISA, there's been a massive focus on how to tackle mis and disinformation in this. Meta and a few of the other platforms have set up these sort of election centers, how to get adequate information. I think the question is, we've been having a lot of focus on the elections in the US for obvious reasons, in the UK, among European countries. There are 193 countries in the UN. Do we set up election centers for all of them? When do we turn and actually ask platforms to turn up an additional nod? And when it comes to oversight, when it comes to responsibility, when it comes to accountability in the actions that are taken leading up to an election? I think that's a good question. That is part of our dialogue with industry, is to say governments can't solve this on their own, platforms can't solve it on their own. Let's have a sort of a dialogue and continuation collaboration around it, and the trusted relationship that this is really something that we need to solve together. And it costs money, but it turns out democracy costs money. So upholding a thriving democracy, it costs money for education. It costs money to have a free and independent good press. And it costs money to support elections, particularly in times of crisis, particularly in times when we are seeing a shrinking of democracy. So I don't see this as a, oh, it would be nice if we could have a bit more integrity. It's like, this is the fundamental pillars that millions of people gave their life for fighting for in the 20th century. And we can either sort of throw it out because it's, too expensive or too challenging to do something, or I think there's a real good moment to say, there's a cost to upholding really strong values, but there's also a massive benefit. There's a huge economic opportunity. There's a social political opportunity for individuals, not just in established democracies, but a bit more broadly. And it is up to us to support, particularly in fragile democracies, where the integrity of elections are the thing that whether they go one way or the other way is dependent on how those elections run. And so it can't be something that we take lightly.
Thank you very much, Naomi, and then Ed.
Thank you. So I think jumping off on the points Anne Marie just made, there's a couple of things I wanted to say. So the first is, this has been said many times, but important to bring here as well. It's not just social media, right? It's traditional media, right, as well, that is perpetuating the big lie, right, or a lot of election misinformation. So when we're looking at the source, right, it can't just be a single media solution. And I think a lot of times we tend to over-rotate on blaming social media for the spread of misinformation when it's definitely traditional media as well. I think when we're talking about resources for content moderation, and particularly on misinformation, a lot of the biggest challenges, in my experience, end up being sort of in these edge cases, right? So when I was at Meta, we'd see things starting to bubble up, and the question would be like, is this something that's going to go viral, right? Is this something that we need to take resources away from other misinformation decision making, right? Because this particular piece of content is the thing that we think is going to break an election. Right. And you saw Twitter make the decision to actively demote, right, and then sort of suppress the Hunter Biden laptop conspiracy in the run up to the 2020 election. And they received a lot of criticism for that later. So I think that there are a lot of challenges in these edge cases and decision-making resources around those. It's not just throwing more ML at it, right? Or throwing more sort of like lower level content moderation resources at it. And I think that there's a broader platform solution here, which isn't discussed a lot, but it is something that my colleagues at the Integrity Institute sort of hold core to their philosophy, which is platforms not optimizing for engagement, right? When platforms build their systems to optimize for engagement, it ends up pushing up the most controversial content to the top for the same reason that newspapers often use the kind of most controversial and splashiest headlines, because that's what draws readers. And that can be a system, that can be a systemic change that can add friction, right? And reduce the resources that are then required to make these sort of high pressure edge case misinformation moderation decisions.
Thank you. Ed?
Yeah, I want to build on what Anne Marie and Naomi have just said, and in the spirit of solutions, I do think that, and I think we're well served to think about not content moderation strictly, which people tend to think of takedowns, but content mediation as a term that kind of embraces the range of interventions that happen. And we have programs with platforms that are serving context. We have worked with platform partners that are adding links adjacent to questionable content, and so I think the takedown is what people think of when they think of content moderation, and certainly in any rational understanding of boundaries of free speech and and content moderation, we understand there's a range of actions that need to be taken. So I think starting there, and then recognizing from that each one of these platforms are engaging in hugely redundant efforts to run these programs, and it is and has historically been the case that trust and safety teams view the work they're doing as being sacrosanct, as privacy respecting, data can't be shared. We tried with Social Science 1 to imagine what it would mean to share data across, but I think that if I can put forward one idea for the policymakers who may be in the room, the model of the CSAM data sharing as a cross-platform resource that brings efficiencies to the task of moderating or mediating content it's an idea whose time has come, I think. And with Twitter drawing back from their investment in content moderation, with many of the teams that we work with at the platforms being severely reduced in this last round of layoffs, thinking about how we can build efficiencies by creating shared data resources. And, you know, in the simplest example, this could be a shared set of all of the fact checks that relate to election integrity in the context of a single election. That's shared with Google, with Meta, with Twitter, with Reddit, with Viber, with WhatsApp, across all of these platforms. We're going to have more efficient systems. We're going to have, you know, in the case of harassing or harmful content, we're going to have fewer of the click workers who are doing this hard work burned out. We're going to see their work amplified and used more broadly, and we're going to have a healthier internet. So I want to, if I can plant one seed, it's to think about shared data resources and what that looks like in a privacy respecting way. Obviously, you're stripping PII from any source content. You're doing everything you can do to clear that bar, but you're thinking about this as a public resource. And I'd like to see, you know, some of the policy people think about crafting that as a meaningful response to what I think is right now arguably an intractable problem. We think about in the US, in the English language, you know, we have billions and billions of messages moving a day. We are catching, you know, of the really harmful, really dangerous content, we're catching a sliver of what we should. And that's one language among 230. As Connor pointed out, we need this is a hugely complex and challenging problem. And until we start thinking about sharing data and making resources go farther, we're not going to meaningfully address it.
Thank you, Connor, and then Cameron.
Yeah, real quick, I just wanted to emphasize, I think, a few points that have already been made, and that is to just sort of dispel, I think, this notion that content moderation or content policy in general is always this binary choice of take down and remove. And, you know, we've obviously seen over the last 2 to 4 years that there are, you know, other tools in the toolbox that can be used towards this. Beyond removal, you can also reduce the prevalence. You can inform users. And just to add, you know, a little bit of complexity, I don't think we've touched on this issue quite yet, but just the harmful health misinfo and the reaction that we had on at the onset of COVID-19. And so that falls into, you know, one of one of the buckets of misinfo that we are, particularly concerned about and trying to act as fast as possible to remove the most egregious, claims that are that put people at risk. And so that process in and of itself also relied on, working externally with experts, identifying those experts who could, and really, I think just exhibiting this value that's embedded within us is to trust expertise, and to bring that onto the platform and give users the information they need. That and if anybody's interested in learning more about that, that's actually documented in the Journal of Online Trust and Safety, which is a new journal that I think is hones in on a lot of these topics. Some of my colleagues who worked on this policy have written about the process of engaging and identifying those group of stakeholders to weigh in on how we should approach COVID-19 and what information should be provided. And so I encourage folks to take a look at that journal publication, which just came out a few months ago.
Thank you. Cameron?
Sure. I wanted to sort of circle back to the top of this topic, the question, who bears the responsibility. I think we've talked about a lot of different facets of how you tackle the problem, but I do think we can hone in on governments and say, what can a government do, right? We can pass regulations. And those regulations can do many things, but the two that I'm most interested in are they can tell us not to do things, right? They can prohibit things, make things illegal, and they can spend money. And so I think to go back to Anne Marie's point about investment in particular, think about the investment in education, there's a lot more money that can be spent on what I think should be a combination of media literacy and civics education. We are far behind where we need to be, right? But there's a lot more room to invest in the resilient side of this to mitigate the impacts of misinformation related to election integrity. And on the other side, I think we can think about what the government can do to regulate these companies, which we have the seeds of in some existing regulations outside of the US, and perhaps in the future we could talk about in the US, that are not necessarily about, compromising freedom of speech, but instead think about online harm as a whole, right? We already have some regulations around online harm. CSAM is the obvious example there, but we can think about how we expand those responsibly. And in particular, I always liken this to other industries that we don't compare it to, but there is a non-zero amount of poison that is allowed in our food, right? But there is also an upper limit. And there's a whole apparatus in place to measure that constantly, to reevaluate that. And those same concepts can apply here, right? And that doesn't mean that the regulation has to be, you must have less than 0.01% of hate speech or misinformation on the platform, right? That might not be the right metric. And so the work to figure out what the metric is part of the process here, but we can create metrics. And maybe that metric, to the point of some of the ideas that both I think Ed and Connor were talking about, like it's about different ways of dealing with it. Maybe all that content can stay on the platform, but we need to reduce the engagement, because the engagement determines how many people are actually seeing it or actually buying into it. So there's a lot of work to be done on defining those metrics, but I do think that the government has a role to play in establishing that we need such metrics so that we're actually on a path to the harm reduction.
Thank you. Since you spoke about the government, I think I'll highlight a question that Eric Goldman asked in the chat, which is, what do you do about governments that initiate the misinformation? Connor?
Yeah, thank you. Tough question. I will beat the drum of really making sure that we are listening to our civil society partners. And we fortunately have a very robust network of trusted partners who are in 113 different countries, many of which are countries that are non-democratic, that are autocratic. And so really making sure that we hone in and listen to those stakeholders who represent marginalized populations within those countries, to hear what they're hearing, and we will always corroborate that with other requests and make a judgment that is grounded in both kind of what they're telling us and trust in those the things that they're raising, and I think also leaning into our respect for numerous human rights frameworks that inform our decisions.
Thank you. Anne-Marie.
This is, I think, an important question, and it goes to when we talk about the need for collaboration with governments and platforms, there is a particular responsibility of democratic governments here. I think for too long we're forgetting that the mega large tech platforms, whether they're covering 20% of the world's populations or 50% of the world's populations, become, de facto geopolitical actors, and so decisions are not neutral, and decisions cannot be taken lightly. So when we see governments, and there are too many doing it, but there are some in particular that are very, very active and have sort of entire media set up to create anti-Western narrative, disinformation, undermining the integrity of our institutions. It is a collaboration also, I think, between platforms and democratic governments. And one, what are the rules of cyberspace? How do we uphold them? And how do we make sure that we are supporting platforms in enforcing their content policy that we've been, through dialogue and diplomacy, trying to get to be much more human rights respecting and to be focusing much more on these issues. So I find there is a need here for sort of pushing that together, and that we can't allow. I mean, when we look at mis and disinformation, it is a relatively few actors. Most of us are not engaged in sort of writing a bunch of mis and disinformation on the platforms. I think regardless of what platform we talk to, they're pretty good at identifying. It's a few state agencies and it's a few actors. Like, I think we're talking less than 1,000, that if you remove them, you would take away 95% of all the mis and disinformation on the internet. And so by recognizing it's actually a few actors, but they are just really good at taking advantage of the algorithmic amplification opportunities that are in this day and age. How do we make sure that we can, if not shut them down, at least turn down the volume and the influence of that? And that is also going to how we tackle the issue of when governments do it.
Thank you. I think we'll now open up to questions from people in the room here at the Chase Center. Who can I pass the mic to?
Oh, hi, I'm Daniel Dresner. I'm a colleague of Professor Trackman and Professor Chakravarty. Thank you all very much for your interesting comments. I want to ask a question about what I detected was a slight tension between what Anne-Marie said and what Connor said about content moderation, which is, if I heard you correctly, Anne-Marie, you were talking about why isn't there more innovation in this area? Why isn't there more, firms that are actually succeeding, thriving, as it were, in terms of content moderation, in terms of developing material? But what I hear from Connor is that there are massive fixed costs required to actually do this properly. And that there's also apparently a fair amount of human capital you have to actually train to be able to do this properly. So I guess my question is, to what extent can you have any kind of innovative ecosystem if the fixed costs for doing this properly are so large that in the end it winds up being only a few firms that have the capital on hand to be able to do it? But correct me if I'm wrong.
I think just we put a man on the moon decades ago. I think we'll be able to come up with good ways of doing content moderation between sort of human resources and what we can do with technology. Living in Silicon Valley, it seems some of the most sophisticated technology. Carbon capture that is actually working, advanced materials, quantum technologies that are going to completely transform our lives around this. Of course, we can do content moderation both on the technical side and on the human resource side. So that is one point. Two, what do we do with that? What the smaller platforms? Let's start by the most valuable companies on the planet, period, right now are the largest platforms. So I think the argument that it costs them on, there's a big there's a big sort of cost to this. Of course there is. That's the business they're in. I mean, of course there is. And so regardless of what your business is in, there are costs associated with security and upholding this. And I am finding, and again, what sort of helps me remain an optimist, I find that a lot of platforms absolutely understand this responsibility. Take Oversight Board. I think that was a pretty significant investment. They did it. And now it's following up on how to do even more of that. Let's help and push and nudge and a carrot and stick model for making sure that they actually love it. It's the same with the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act from the European Union. We expect very, very large platforms to invest a lot of money and be able to live up to this, have accountability, better transparency. I don't think it's too much to ask for the fundamental infrastructure of modern life. And so the second one on what do we do with other platforms? Sure, there are some that are have a wholly different income and different business models and are operated differently, but their policies also. Wikimedia is a good example. Wikipedia functions quite differently. The problems and challenges around mis and disinformation are also quite different. So I think it's important, if there are open source platforms that don't necessarily have the revenue and necessary profits to invest in content moderation, let's look at public-private partnerships for that. But it's important to separate the two, so we have a bit more of I think a sort of fair approach of what can we actually ask in terms of the cost of doing good content moderation, which I think better content moderation will be a source of income, because it will ultimately make a lot more people much more interested in staying on the platforms rather than seeing some of the rejection that we see today because it's become what it is.
Thank you, Naomi, and then Tiffany.
Thanks. So yeah, I have to agree. And I think, the Oversight Board is it's one model. It relies on some very high profile individuals doing this work. There is a certain cost associated with that. When you have a smaller platform and you have less content and you have less users, you also have more flexibility to experiment and try out new designs at a lower cost, right? So I think that the creative thinking around what that investment looks like is going to be really important here. I also think, Ethan Zuckerman at the Stanford Trust and Safety Conference a few months ago had a closing keynote that was this laying out this dynamic between sort of governance of and by the community, as opposed to content moderation as sort of like a customer service function, right? And he spoke a lot to this idea that early internet, the community came together to make a decision about what to do with actors in the community that were violating their norms, right, or their rules. And that sort of gave way to a much more transactional customer service function of kicking people off a platform. So I think that there's also a opportunity here to move towards more of a decentralized governance model. I think Reddit sort of is the best example of this currently, right? Where there's different communities and they have their own rules and they decide collectively how to enforce those up until a certain point where it's CSAM or they're violating the law, right? And there's always going to be edge cases that challenge this model, but I don't think that, I just disagree that it is inherently cost prohibitive. And the last point that I would just make here is that, again, a lot of this can be dealt with in platform design, right? When you're starting out designing a platform, understanding that content moderation is going to be one of your core costs, and it's going to be one of the things that keeps or drives people away from the platform. And so designing a platform that already creates incentives for good behavior. So not optimizing for engagement, right? Optimizing for quality or good user experience instead. And obviously all of those things need to be defined, but I think there's just a lot of room for creativity here.
Thank you, Tiffany, and then Ed and Connor, and then Bhaskar will end the discussion for today for this path. Thank you, Tiffany.
Great, thanks. I have two slightly unrelated points. Just something Naomi said about the idea of collective checks. It reminded me that, when COVID was a huge misinformation problem, especially early 2020, 2021, there was a lot said about the value of community fact checking and community defense, where misinformation that percolated through digital channels was actually best fought offline in local communities, churches, teachers, and by people that are trustworthy in certain areas, right? And I think that's something that has not been discussed as much since. The importance of not relying on labels or removals or downvoting, that sort of thing, but finding entities that are trusted by the people who are exposed to misinformation to try to block that misinformation. Separately, off of Anne-Marie's point, I think something that's been coming up a lot more in my discussions with researchers and with people who combat disinformation for a living is that there's a misconception that disinformation only exists via text. There's a whole world of images, of videos, of audio, where this is becoming more of a problem. And to try to ginny up the investment to battle those sorts of things is really difficult because those require kind of technological capacity that often doesn't really exist yet. So to have to develop the tools to combat that sort of thing is hard. And I think we're really at the cutting edge of that. And a lot of smaller platforms and smaller players don't have the resources to handle that yet.
Ed?
Thanks. Yeah, maybe I'm gonna just acknowledge Eric's robust contributions to the chat and his notion that content moderation is a less well-defined target than the moon circling overhead, and so I think the metaphor, Anne-Marie's metaphor, does pertain. It is a task of that scope and scale, but maybe it helps to reframe the challenge here as the internet itself is missing a context layer. And if we think about a structural, a moon project to address the mis and disinformation challenge, instead of thinking of that as a sheer how do we develop the algorithms, how do we put the human bodies behind this, but instead thinking how do we afford individual users the capacity to present context on top of the content they're encountering online. And given that the clear harm to society, whether that's in an election setting or a pandemic setting, of rampant disinformation is a huge cost, we should distribute to society and the platforms the cost of building out the content moderation and content and context building efforts. If that is taken as a public task, it's easier to imagine platforms sharing that data. It's easier to imagine that the enormous effort of building out data sets, not just fact checks, but data sets of harassing content keywords, data sets of election denying or electoral process misleading content, having that shared and an available resource to the content moderation teams across the internet, I think is a healthier view of how our information ecosystems could work. So I think that an idea like that accommodates Eric's concerns, and thinking about a pull model where I, as an end user, am deciding what parts of that index, what parts of, what authorities, what third-party fact checkers I want to have operating on the index that I'm encountering, is maybe a world where it's less top-down and more about creating these resources that communities or individuals can decide to deploy. So solutioneering and dreaming, but I think it's worth throwing into the mix.
Thank you, Connor, and then Bhaskar.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just close real quick by I think just sharing or appreciating, it may not always seem like it, but how far I think we have come in this conversation as a society. Earlier this year in September, I attended the Trust and Safety Professional Association's first and annual conference, which brought together professionals who have worked in this space for a decade or more, or some who have just been working in it in a couple of years. And it was just really insightful to see, some of the early pioneers who worked on these issues, who were writing these rules for the very first time in the late 2000s, even up to 4 years ago when Meta didn't even publish its community standards. So I do think there are ways in which we're getting better at this, and I do want to appreciate that. But to Anne Marie's point, I think this is not as at the top of the panel. This is not as good as it gets, and we have to do better. And I think we didn't even touch on in this panel on implications for the metaverse and for augmented and virtual reality and content moderation in those spaces. But there's going to be a lot to learn, and there's going to be a lot of things that we need to adapt to in the future. So this issue isn't going away, and I think it kind of follows in the line of an age-old question of, how do media systems, any media systems, continue to serve the values of democracy. And so I'll close just with those thoughts, but thanks again for everybody, and great discussion.
Okay, now that I'm appropriately unmuted. Yeah, okay, excellent. Thank you so much for this incredibly insightful conversation. I know that we didn't find a solution, but we didn't expect it. But we had elements of the solution. It's kind of like, I imagine a number of smart people sitting around a massive jigsaw puzzle table with all these puzzle pieces scattered all over. We started with quite a pile of puzzle pieces, but we began to see some elements, some of those pieces sort of fitting together. And one aspect of it is that this is not a problem that's going to be solved by the platforms alone. However, the platforms can do more. That's something we heard. We also heard the fact that it is important to bring in all the other stakeholders, not just government and regulators, but civil society and other actors, both individual and from organizations. It's important to put context into content and help educate people to be able to read content in context. And when we say people, those people are in schools right now. And from primary school onwards, this is an education system that needs to build that contextual intelligence in schools. Tiffany, you talked about the role of the community, churches and so on. This is the way we build democracy and get people elected to office, and there's a role for the community to play there as well. And of course, there's technology, the ongoing march of technology, whether it's quantum and other forms of technology. Let me close here with just a quick anecdote. I was sharing some of our recent research on misinformation, particularly as it's coming out on Twitter. We've been analyzing the top 20 most engaged tweets on Twitter across a number of different categories, and I'm sharing that with the journalists. And no matter what which email I would send it to, she just couldn't receive it. And it turned out that the email system was kicking my content off because my content had all kinds of pretty horrible stuff on it. So even the most primitive technologies like email, seem to have some ways to capture the bad stuff, which is good to know. But it can be annoying when you're trying to get some work done that involves bad stuff. That said, I want to take a thread from something that was just mentioned earlier today by Cameron. He used the analogy of food safety, and this is a perfect segue to our next panel, which we will, first we'll have food. For those of us who are in the room, I'm sorry you're missing some, pretty flavorful meals from what we can tell from the aroma in the room here. So please grab some beverages and lunch so that you can join us virtually, but do come back. We will reconvene at what time? 2:30 Eastern time, where we are going to take this thread of food safety, but not actually talking about food safety, but go to other arenas where similar issues have arisen, and maybe there are some solution elements, some ideas, some analogies that we might be able to pull in from these other areas, and use that as a jumping off point for a wide open conversation, because I'm sure many of you here in the room and in Zoom have some ideas that we've been sharing on chat, and we'd like to kind of get that in an open forum. So thank you, everybody. I'm particularly grateful to all our panelists for joining, and this has been a perfect conversation. Our appreciation. Thank you. Professor of International Politics at the Fletcher School. Dan, take it away. Oh, thank you.
Can you all hear me now? Okay, very good. My marching orders were to be the designated Eeyore of this conference, which was to say that given what I've heard before, and also given my work, I am, let's just say, extremely pessimistic about the likelihood of there being any kind of global compact when it comes to content moderation. Part of this is due to my own work on regulatory coordination that I published actually more than exactly 15 years ago, which is depressing in a number of ways. But anyway, in that argument, in that book, what I argued was that essentially the problem in terms of content moderation in the internet isn't so much about the tech, it's about the dramatic differences in terms of values and standards and cultural norms that are felt across borders. And so therefore, what one country might consider as obscene, another country considers as protected speech, and vice versa. And that there has been nothing in the last 15 years to make me any more optimistic about the likelihood of content moderation being successfully done at the global level. Namely, first of all, the rise of another large market jurisdiction in China that has its own very divergent attitudes when it comes to content moderation. And for all the talk about the Brussels effect, the problem is that while the European Union is a significant actor, it's hardly the only actor. And so I'm extremely pessimistic about there being a race to the top in terms of these kinds of standards. Indeed, when we talk about domestic regulation, the Brussels effect is often analogized to what's called the California effect that David Vogel talked about, but there is also Delaware, or at least globally what we refer to as the race to the bottom. And in the absence of a great power concert, I am relatively pessimistic of the ability to actually develop content regulation at the global level. And if it is, it would take the form of something along the lines of a sham standard. In other words, there might be a standard that was promulgated. Maybe there will even be a UN conference devoted to it. There will, be many, hosannas to way we finally take a step in the right direction, and the enforcement will be modest. It will be toothless, and in point of fact, there really will not be anything in the way of substantive content moderation, which is potentially a problem. And to be honest, nothing I've heard today persuades me or dissuades me from that conclusion. Even in the panel that we just had, there was, discussion that we have 1 million miles to go, and other statements, saying that we're essentially just at the beginning of this in terms of the tech side. So I am resolutely pessimistic that you are going to have any kind of content moderation at a global level, when in fact the degree of consensus at the global level on what should be regulated is lower now than it was a generation. And this is a problem. Now that said, I also maybe am just like, drunk I'm high on my own supply of ideas. Maybe it's the case that when I wrote All Politics is Global, I believe that argument will stay true ad infinitum, and I'm willing to be persuaded otherwise. And so this leads us to our two speakers today. Professor Carlo Garbarino, I apologize, who is a professor of law at Bocconi University in Milan, where he's the director of the Osservatorio Fiscale, and has also held a number of different positions before that. And we're also going to hear from Dr. Federico Lupo Cassini, who's the associate professor in commercial and corporate law at Durham Law School. And the reason we're going to talk to them is essentially, while I am pessimistic about whether this will work, it is true that there has been somewhat successful coordination in other issue areas. And so the questions we're going to ask both Professor Garbarino and Professor Lupo Cassini is whether or not, what are the success stories that they talk about, and can those success stories offer any kind of lessons that can be applied toward content moderation. So we're going to have each of these speakers speak for 10 minutes. Then I might ask a provocative question or two, and then we will take questions from the audience. I look forward to this. Professor Garbarino, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I noticed that, okay, can you hear me? Hello to everybody. It's fantastic to be there from Europe. I guess also Federico is from Europe. You have, in the last session, basically, you have asked 2 Italian speakers to save the world. So I will see whether I can do my part. When Professor Trackman asked me to take the international tax experience into the content moderation debate, I was kind of taken aback. But then, after reflection, I thought that I don't know whether you have read my paper, but you will be able to read the paper if you like. That there is a kind of policy argument which is based on the assumption that international tax and content moderation are problems that are engendered by the prominent role of platforms. So as far as there is a kind of opportunistic use of platforms in international taxation, we can say that there is an immoderate use of platforms, generally speaking. So briefly speaking, in international taxation, I cannot say that there is one fine global solution. The international community is trying to address the problem, but there are basically the problem in international taxation is the fact that platforms, multinationals, have an opportunistic stance and basically arbitrage between different rates. They place profits in low tax jurisdiction and cost in high tax jurisdiction, end up not paying taxes basically, or paying a lower tax than. Of course, the time is very short, and I cannot go in detail. So basically, we have. I'm just describing a few concepts that I will use. We have stateless profits that don't find the state where they are taxed. The OECD, the international community, is trying to address this basically using a kind of allocation criteria of allocation. Yes, they asked me to increase the volume, and is that any better?
A little better.
Okay, great. It's 100%. So basically, they are trying to use an allocation criteria, but a very wide number of scholars and policymakers propose to go through minimum standards, minilateralism, and a kind of unilateral policies that are coordinated. I try to describe that. Basically, the point is that if a country where the multinationals are based take the responsibility of taxing multinational their global profits, so they subject to their national regulation, extraterritorial national regulation, their multinational, then of course tax competition is doomed because it's impossible to arbitrage between different rates. So, and the minimum standard would be to address, to agree about the minimum rate. They're talking about 50%. And basically, minilateralism is the idea that you have to find a coalition which is composed by the lowest minimum number of states that can achieve the highest result. So basically, in international taxation, if you put together the countries that host 90% of the multinationals, if all these states agree of taxing globally the multinationals, you should have solved the problem. It's the kind of global public good issue. So, I mean, if it is, so the policy argument that I try to describe to you, and of course, this is not, the panacea, but, it's a possibility. I mean, if you have, free flow of capital in international taxation, you have free flow of information in general. If you have stateless profits or income in international taxation, you have a kind of stateless information in general, which escapes the reach of states. And if you can conceive of a coalition of states subjecting their platforms, the multinational, to certain kind of minimum standards, and here you can have one or more coalitions. And if you can think in terms of unilateralism, then the hypothesis is that you, to a certain extent, you can do the same with content moderation. Another similarity is what I called, I have heard the term intractability before during the conference, the intractability problem. You cannot address this problem of content moderation, and you cannot address the problem of international or taxation of multinationals from a territorial standpoint. Because if you define rules that are limited by the territory of states, then multinational arbitrage, platforms arbitrage. So here we have, basically certain similarities that are in a way making it possible to use this policy argument. Certainly, and has been very clear, and the chairman has highlighted that, and the discussion today was basically about that, particularly in the previous session. Of course, the problem of taxation is basically follow the money. Follow the money, tax the money. For example, follow the US multinationals, tax them in the US at 15%, and they can't do anything other than paying the 15% tax. But of course, content moderation is a semantic problem, is a very subtle problem. You have so many different approaches. So that's the basic difference. And I would like here to highlight a general point that has already been mentioned today. There is a procedural approach. So basically, the idea of forcing a multinational to report all profits in the country of residence is basically a procedural reporting. So basically, and I get to the point here, the idea that could be discussed in the area of in the area of global moderation in terms of international agreements. Of course, you have a mosaic of national legislation that's overlap and that are not, of course, cannot address the problem globally. Then, of course, you could think of one or more coalitions of states based on their standards and reason to set minimum standards of content moderation, basically providing for disclosures and a kind of procedural accountability, basically. But then you can have, 2 or 3 different models, and so 2 or 3 different minilateralist coalitions. And on the basis of that, every member of the coalition has the ethical, political, and legal responsibility of enforcing the minimum standard, whatever it is, on the platforms based in that state. So it may sound kind of old-fashioned idea, because platforms, as we know, are by definition global, but basically, look, for example, in the Twitter Saga, they have a corporate form. They have, they are company, a group of companies. There are shareholders. There is a board of directors. There is corporate liability, and so on and so forth. So basically, by using, the traditional idea of subjecting companies, and basically you are talking here about a limited number of global actors to the rules of the country of residence that is agreed with a number of other countries that more or less share the same view and share the same problems, then possibly you could have a coalition based on cooperation, and one or more coalition could then grow and end up with some sort of I wouldn't say competing, but coexisting standards about content moderation. Clearly, you can have there was a speaker from China, and she clearly said that our Western approach cannot be done or agreed by China, and unfortunately the other way around. And of course, you do have an approach, for example, in certain countries, the first world, in Africa, and so on and so forth. Okay, good. I mean, the beauty is the difference, and then possibly this could be an avenue, of course, in the direction of designing and implementing a kind of multilateral, multinational, global solution. Instead of the necessarily existing fragmented solutions that we have if we follow the principle of territoriality. If you come to Italy, you're a platform, you have to follow the Italian rules. If you end up in Brazil, you have to follow the Brazilian rules, and so on and so forth. So that's basically all, folks. This is the argument. And this is, of course, I put it on the table for discussion without any expectation that this is going to save the world in terms of content moderation, because it's a huge problem, as all the speakers and the chairman of this session have already very clearly highlighted. That's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Carlo. That was actually under time, so bravo, well done. Federico, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
We're good.
Very good. Well, again, thank you very much for inviting me to this event. So it's somehow like comforting, and at the same time a little bit ironic that you asked me to draw some lessons from international financial regulation, while a week ago TFX, the crypto exchange, blew up with I think 14 billion. And 2 months ago here in the UK, we have the pension system that almost was blown up because of some derivative schemes that they were using to hedge positions. And nevertheless, international financial regulation, despite everything, has managed to achieve one of the best examples of regulatory cooperations, the Basel Accord, which we might simply call Basel III. Now, first of all, why did Professor Trackman ask me to to draw a parallel between platforms and banking regulation? Well, there are essentially three main similarities, in my view, between platforms and cross-border banks. So the first one is both platforms and banks operate in an ecosystem. They're not alone in their business. They need to rely on this ecosystem to work. For banking is the financial system. Banks are connected with depositors, bondholders, investor, money market funds. And on the other side, they invest their money in other banks. They lend to the real economy, to businesses. They invest. They have substantial trading operations. And essentially, they operate in this ecosystem, and they need that in order to survive and to work. Similarly, platforms also, to my understanding, operate in an ecosystem. They cannot operate alone. They need users, developers, and very often they connect with other platforms that connect to each other. So the first similarity essentially is the fact that are operating in a network. Secondly, while the network provides substantial economic positive economic effects, it can also provide some very, very harmful effects. Because when firms, banks, and platforms produce harmful effect through their activities, the harmful effects are enhanced by the fact that those entities, the firms and the platforms, operate in a network, because then the network effects, the negative externalities reverberates throughout the network. In banking, the negative externality is the fact that banks, by definition, need to take risk in order to operate. And sometimes when they take too much risk, they end up disrupting the entire financial system. So they end up producing what we call in finance systemic risk. Platforms also produce harmful effect through their harmful contact activities every now and then. And again, the fact that they operate in a network simply enhances these negative effects. Three, like platforms, banks, especially cross-border banks, operate in a global system. So they don't operate in closed national system where do not branch out in other jurisdictions, but they do actually operate in multiple jurisdictions at the same time. However, they are regulated by only one jurisdiction. And here is the problem, because there is an asynchrony between the scope of the market, which is global, and the scope of the regulation, which is national. And this is actually the fundamental problems that international finance faces. Now, however, despite that, we have one good example of cooperation. And the example of cooperation, as I said before, is the Basel Accord. Now, in the 1980s, banks were more or less in the same position where platforms were right now. They were operating across the globe, and there was different regulatory approaches to bank. One in particular, the imposition of capital ratios to banks, was the key problems that regulators were facing. Essentially, the problem was very simple. Capital adequacy increased the stability of the financial system, they increase the solvency of banks. However, they are expensive. The US and the UK regulator, back then the two biggest Western markets, decided that they wanted to impose capital adequacies to their banks, despite being quite expensive. However, the Japanese regulators, and back then Japanese banks were extremely active, especially in the US, didn't want to impose any regulatory capital standards to their banks. Japanese banks were extremely aggressive in the US, and they were conquering market, and these were putting US and UK banks at a serious disadvantage. And there was a regulatory turf between the three regulators. So how this was solved? It was solved by the adoption of harmonized standards, Basel I, which is now Basel III, which put all regulators on the same footing. I mean, back then was not straightforward that regulators were going to cooperate. And here I move to the positive notes. How did that happen? Well, it happened for four main reasons. Number one, regulators were not operating in a vacuum. They were not operating in silos. Despite regulators being, of course, focused on their own financial system, because they are statutory, they have a statutory objective to protect their own financial system. They were nevertheless engaged in dialogues. These dialogues were taking place in Basel, Switzerland, where the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, this transnational regulatory network, was hosting a lot of discussions, closed-door discussions between them. The fact that regulators could discuss among them, fight among them behind closed doors, increased the pressure on regulators to achieve kind of truce and an agreement. So number one lesson is it's important to have a place, a physical place, or an entity that can host discussions between regulators. It doesn't need to be open. Actually, I think the best is to have secret discussions where all the political issues can be discussed with behind closed doors. And this is the first lesson. I'm not sure whether platforms do have right now a place like the Basel Committee. There are a couple of networks that are not in my papers, but my understanding is that they're not extremely active. Second lesson that you can draw from the Basel Accord is the cooperative and stability enhancing solution was backed by the two major powers. And here I rely on Professor Dresner, who is the mastermind behind this theory. The two great powers of the day, the UK and the US, were on the very same page when it came to the adoption of capital adequacy ratios. Because the two biggest financial centers were on the same page, Japan had no other option but to agree. After the US and the UK, also the Europeans went with the US and the UK. So Japan was actually left alone. And Japan was put in a corner. Either they agree or simply the US would have cut Japan from the US market, which was the biggest market for lending back then. So second lesson, if the two biggest powers, and more or less this is also what Carlos said just before, if the two biggest power agree, then they will create this critical mass that will allow the minor powers to go along. The third lesson is that Basel I and Basel III was a very, very flexible instrument. Was flexible because, first of all, was at the beginning a very, very simple agreement. It was only 30 pages. There was not much detail. Right now, Basel III is 1,400 pages. But back then it was only 30. It was very simple. The fact that it was so simple allowed regulators to convince their politicians to adopt it. Also, this agreement, right, like right now, is non-binding. So regulators can decide not to adopt it, and if they want to adopt it, they can tweak it to a certain extent. This allows regulators to accommodate political concerns, domestic concerns, economic concerns. Once you have agreed, then you can improve the agreement like Basel did. Basel II was more complicated than Basel I, and Basel III is much more complicated than Basel II. But right now, regulators are already on the same board, and improving is much easier than agreeing. If you agree to a 1,400, if you want to propose a 1,400 pages document as the very first template, then realistically, you won't be able to achieve any cooperation. So third lesson, flexibility is key. And here, my suggestion would be for platforms to create a very, very basic framework, maybe object-based, that simply states some goals and then work from there. Fourth lesson, cooperation was easier in capital adequacy regulation because it's much easier to cooperate on rules, on standards, than it is to cooperate in other areas. In banking, we have, for instance, cross-border banking resolution, where incentives are extremely, incentives to defect are extremely high. So when it comes to standards, the complication is to put the regulators on the same board at the beginning. But once they agree, then there is very little incentive to defect. In Basel, that was achieved because there was a lot of pressure that was put on regulators not to defect once they had adopted, because the IMF, the World Bank, considered Basel III as the best standard you can get. Also because financial markets want country to adopt Basel III as a regulatory tool, because it gives stability, it gives a signal of the seriousness of the financial system. And so fourth lesson is, once you make the effort to cooperate, once you can get a minimum critical mass, then incentive to defect are very low. And I stop here with my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Federico. That was very clear, and I particularly appreciated the parallels you made between Basel I and Basel III and content moderation. I have a whole host of questions, but let me ask a basic one, which is in some ways, and it cuts in different ways for both of you. Federico, you talked a lot about Basel I and Basel III, and those generally are acknowledged to be relatively effective examples of successful standard setting and successful regulatory coordination. You did skip Basel II, however, and we have to bring up Basel II because Basel II is a touch awkward for this story, because Basel II was the standard that was put in place towards the end of the century. It was pushed by, among other things, the banks themselves to try to regulate capital adequacy, and essentially argued that the way that banks calculate what they considered, what their capital adequacy was, should be based on something called mark to model rather than mark to market. We don't need to get into technical details. The important thing about Basel II is that Basel II wound up leading to pro-cyclical lending, which was exactly the thing that the Basel standards were supposed to stop doing. In other words, Basel III and Basel I, or Basel III in particular, is designed to prevent bubbles from occurring. Basel II is now recognized after the fact as not the primary explanation, but one of the sources for the buildup of toxic debts that then leads to 2008. So this leads to two questions. And the one I guess I would ask Federico is, all of the examples you gave are all the sort of conditions you raised for how you get to successful coordination are correct, but they also lead to Basel II. So what happened? What is the guarantee that the content moderation that was actually agreed upon will actually be valuable as opposed to triggering a catastrophe? And I guess my question to Carlo as well is, one of the underlying premises we have in terms of talking about all of this in terms of content moderation is that presumably governments are going to know how to do this properly. And this requires that governments have the requisite expertise, the requisite knowledge to be able to do this. It was not clear in some times in financial regulation whether that was true. It waxed and waned. I guess my question is whether this has been true in terms of tax law, and whether, more importantly, this will be true when it comes to content moderation, given, to be brutally honest, the market for skilled human capital in this. What is the incentive for someone to work for a regulator as opposed to work for the private sector? So Federico, I'll start with you, and then I'll go to Carlo.
Yeah, thank you very much. So you are correct. I mean, Basel II was a very flawed interlude, between the first and the second and the third. It was flawed because regulators were regulators were on the same page even there. Essentially, they gave in to the pressure of their banking sector, which essentially wanted to bypass by using the internal risk models. Now, is there a risk that platforms will end up in the very same page, in the very same situation? To be honest, like I'm not very familiar with the politics of platforms. So what I can say is I can simply draw a lesson from Basel II, and the lesson is do not allow the industry to guide regulators, because if there is one lesson that we learn with Basel II is that if you let the industry, do what it wants, then in the end, it's like not having an agreement, because the industry will simply not consider the external impact of their action. So my suggestion is simply for whoever is the regulator to be firm. And essentially, this unfortunately, I don't know much about platforms to see whether there is any politics behind. That is my only lesson that I can learn from Basel II.
Thank you very much, Federico. Carla? Hold on, you're still muted.
Can you hear me?
Now we're good. Go ahead.
Better than before?
Yes, actually.
Oh, fantastic. So the headphones work. So, well, thank you for your question. In fact, talking about taxes, of course, there is a bias in terms of state regulation because, they are the owner of tax sovereignty. But indeed, yes, in the current framework of international politics, where according to certain approaches, we have a kind of neo-pluralist approach. So you have a state actor and non-state actor, and private actors that can be ONG, but can be also multinational firms, and even if you want personify the platforms themselves, so networks of communication. Then, of course, you do have regulation also by non-state actors. So I think, in reaction to your question, that indeed, and as Federico just said, if you have to start with a tough state regulator that sets standards that are at least traditionally enforced and posed through rules. In addition to that, you can have also a kind of self-regulation that does not indulge in letting the industry doing their their business, basically not regulating themselves. I would like to add that comparing what Luca said about Basel, in any event, you have to take in consideration that particularly at the end of the last century, there wasn't yet a multipolar world, and it was the heyday of the Washington Consensus. So basically in the financial world, in the economy, also look, for example, the World Trade Organization, it's easier to within the neoliberal framework for the neoliberal actors to find an agreement on certain basic rules that when you get to other issues, including content moderation, that is dramatically an anthropological and cultural issue, then of course you have much more fragmentation and you have to live with that. So in that sense, if that is an answer to your question, non-state actors can be very important if they basically bounce. There is a kind of rebound effect with some sort of basic regulation. Otherwise, we end up rather than a kind of Washington Consensus in a fragmented world, completely fragmented world, which in content moderation maybe is not that bad, because I respect the idea of content moderation that other cultures have, and they have a right to pursue that idea of content moderation. Of course, not considering violation of human rights and basic, democratic rights that I think it's an idea that we should all share independently from the jurisdiction. Okay.
Thank you very much. Let me ask one last question, and I'm going to put it to the audience, which is, one of the reasons why you get Basel III is because of the 2008 financial crisis. And, we talk about it as like a layman moment. And in some ways, that's actually been like a term of art now. But the idea is that you had a shock that created a policy window where you could have actually regulators step in. And I guess, and in some ways, it worked for both Basel III and to some extent for tax havens, because France took up the sort of banner on that in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. I guess my question is that when it comes to content moderation, and I recognize I'm asking you to speak in some ways out of your area of expertise, but I guess, can we analogize? Is there a layman moment, or have we been so inured to examples of, let's say, misinformation with the 2016 election, or examples of cyberbullying, or other examples that in other words, is there a moment, or for that matter, are we experiencing that moment now with Elon Musk buying Twitter and, seeing what's happening to that platform, which would actually sort of put it to the front of the policy queue and actually generate the kind of political momentum you would need for even limited international coordination?
Are you asking to me?
I'm asking both of you, but if you want to go first, go ahead.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I don't think there is anything like financial crisis. Harmful speech is really nothing compared to businesses blowing up, and with all the disruption that it takes with it. So I'm not sure there's going to be a lemon moment. However, I had another thought that while Carlo was speaking, I thought that actually, to be honest, there are certain platforms that are regulated in a way, or could be regulated quite easily. And I'm thinking about Facebook with Libra. The payment, Facebook essentially was prevented from regulators from doing anything. And there, was really put back into its place very, very quickly. And the same if any of those platforms would like to enter into the financial market by providing either payment services or lending services or deposits, they would be regulated in a nanosecond, very, very quickly. So there are options for regulating. I'm not sure that actually free speech could equate to that. But who knows?
No, that's an interesting insight. And of course, actually, I think for Twitter, Elon Musk actually did apply for a license to engage in payments. He's talking about trying to convert Twitter to there. So that'll be interesting to see if it actually succeeds. Carlo, do you have any thoughts?
Not really on that point. I basically share Federico's view. Yes, okay. Definitely.
All right. Well, now is the time where we can go to the audience. I guess I will start with anyone in the room that has questions, and then we can go to the chat.
I saw there are certain questions on the chat. I don't know whether we need to answer them in the chat itself.
Let's see if there are any questions in the room, and then I can't actually see the chat, so I'm going to defer to someone who can. And then those questions will be asked. But first, any questions in the room? Yeah, we have two. So hold on, Cecilia, and then yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Hi. Thank you both.
I identify who you are, please. Sorry.
Hi. Yes, I'm Cecilia. I'm a second-year student in Public Affairs at the Fletcher School. I have two questions. So here we're comparing the financial sector and then content regulation. Are these really comparable? We're talking about, we're saying, Professor Luper, that it's businesses blowing up compared to just harmful and hateful speech. And the sense of urgency may not be the same. And also we're talking about more political and sensitive issues when we're talking about content moderation. So how is that going to affect global coordination? And the second part, second question is just, So the EU has a TSA. To what extent is that success in enforcement going to influence possibilities of future cooperation, coordination across the globe? Thank you.
So shall I start on?
Sure, go ahead.
I'm not sure. I totally understood the second question. I couldn't hear very well the second question. On the first question, are they similar? So, of course, there are different businesses. However, there are certain similarities when it comes to the externalities that they create and the fact that there are both platforms, there are both firms that both type of businesses are firms that operate on a global level and have very high incentive to essentially use their network in order to maximize their profit. And as I said in my intervention, this is actually the problems. And the problem is fundamentally similar, to be honest. Then, of course, banks and financial firms in general, when they go bust, they go with a bang. Whereas, of course, harmful speech is not as it's not as harmful, economically speaking. So maybe it doesn't have the very same, it doesn't give the very same political push to regulators to essentially step up and do something. But that's just my opinion, nevertheless.
Carlo, do you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just connect to Federico. To say, even that was not a question directly asked to me, that while maybe financially there is a great difference between content moderation and financial problems, paradoxically, I see a great functional similarity between content in moderation, the problem, and the opportunistic use of platforms for tax purposes. Basically, in both cases, we have an outcome of the use of platforms that is, in a very wide sense, detrimental. So it's a wrong use of platforms, or more precisely, is the fact that when we have networks and global platforms, then you do have a kind of peculiar outcome. In terms of content moderation, in terms of taxes, you have this peculiar outcome that they basically outsmart, territories and tax sovereignties, creating a fictitious tax world where they don't pay taxes. And this is clearly an abuse. In content moderation, I think that, although it is certainly fair and necessary to limit, fake news and outrageous contents, such as, whatever kind of, excessive abuse you can imagine. On the other hand, we still think in terms of, like you were still in the last century, in terms that, the platforms and the digital world narrates to us a reality, a representational truth. It's like a picture. There is a horse, and the horse is in the world and is represented semiotically by the picture, right? But unfortunately, I would say that, excluding outrageous contents, 80% of the contents of platforms are distorted by structurally. So, the only way to address them is to set standards and reporting issues based also on a pluralistic view of values that underlie these standards. And that's why I said that, you could have coalitions, not just one coalition, right? As far as the EU is concerned, if I have understood the question correctly, well, I mean, here in Europe, we are always very critical of the EU, and there are many reasons to be critical of the EU. But one amazing thing that the EU has done in the last 50 years is that when we reach unanimity and we have a top-down binding, legislative measures, so regulation or directives, that's, an amazing vehicle for harmonization about issues such as content moderation that need a minimum standard. So the Digital Service Act, I mean, you may like it or not, but in any event is a top-down standard that regulates 27 state jurisdiction forming the European Union, and so it can contribute to global regulation as a region much more than any other region in the world, because it's the only place where if you accept federal states, but that's another story, where you have harmonized the regulation on issues. And why maybe it's difficult to regulate certain issues when you get to certain values, such as content moderation or the correct use of platform. Maybe we can give some sort of contribution to the global discussion in terms of Europeans.
Thank you, Carlo. Katarina?
Thank you so much for the insightful presentation. I'm Katyayani, a second year master's student. So I just wanted to know the view of the panel with regard, am I audible?
Go ahead.
I wanted to know the view of the panel with regard to what the source of the crisis or the source of post-issues surrounding content moderation is. And are we focusing on the right cause or the core of the problem when talking about content moderation, be it in terms of regulating platforms or publishers or ad agencies? Thank you so much.
Can you then please restate the question?
Sure.
Because there was some acoustics.
Katarina's question, I think, was with respect to this regulatory question, are we focusing on the right actors? In other words, what is the source of the problem here? And if we're focusing on platforms, is that the right thing to focus on? Focusing on the publishers, is that the better way to do it? I'll take a bullet on this one, which is to say, it's again worth remembering that unfortunately this panel doesn't necessarily know a ton about content moderation. We're coming in from expertise from other areas, but I think that it would be safe to say that from my understanding, the problem is that first you have actors that feel that they're incentivized if they provide misinformation or disinformation. Because doing so attracts more attention, and there's an attention economy involved there. The other possibility is that you, of course, have state actors that have an incentive to occasionally sow disinformation as part of their larger foreign policy practices. And that, in turn, would be something that is of some concern, particularly if one of the reasons they're doing that is to try to, sow discord in countries that they see as potentially their adversaries. There's a couple of other things going on, obviously, as well, in terms of things like just plain old-fashioned business scams. Never underestimate that as a source of incentives. But I think I'm going to answer that, unless Carlo or Federico, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah. Let me jump in just quickly.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question. We should not forget, all right, that we live in an era of extractive digital capitalism. So basically, we do have a few major players that are extracting data from our skin, our life, and making huge profits out of that. And they're doing that through platforms. Content moderation is the nice, summit of the iceberg. But the problem out there is that there is a systematic structure, distortion of news and extraction of data to create new markets and make new profits. So, a very democratic and libertarian approach to the problem of content moderation is that, of course, we can, find agreement in terms of limit the extreme situation of, fake truths and extreme content, and this is a kind of regulatory problem. We can kind of live that with the political side where you have different views of the world that are sometimes are conflicted, but then the underlying core is there is the extractive digital economy that I don't think is, entirely advantageous for everybody. I think it's certainly advantageous for a few players.
Thanks.
Not for the
We have time for one more question. I want to get to it before we wrap up. So last question, and don't forget to identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Madakshi. I'm an incoming mall student. So I think when you look at the Basel Accords, it had the advantage of a financial sector that already had an established set of regulations and laws. And so you could pinpoint where the loophole or the lacuna is, and then you knew what to fix. And then you had the international community coming together and addressing that problem. When it comes to misinformation, there's a lot of ambiguity around that, right? There is no concrete law, regulation, policy present today where you can identify ABC is the issue and let's come together and fix it. And that also sort of links me to the point of rigid regulations, because that is something that we spoke about again and again in this panel. So how do you bring in those rigid regulations when one, in the face of so much ambiguity, and two, in the face of the issue of freedom of speech and the constant threat of a constitutional challenge to something like this in different countries? Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to say one quick thing, and then I'll go to either both of you if you have anything. Which is, first, it's worth remembering misinformation or disinformation. You're right that it's a contested subject, but in some ways, I think one of the parallels with finance to misinformation, to digital world, is that misinformation has been around since the existence of the internet. This is not a new phenomenon. What you can argue is new is the fact that it's actually having that the real world implications of this have been amplified in ways that we didn't anticipate until, let's say, 2016 or what have you. And so part of this is the intersection, I think, between what's going on online, but also changes in, underlying society that have made it a more fertile ground for it now, perhaps, than it used to be. Carlo, Federico, do you have any responses?
Well, I think, just a quick reaction that, frankly speaking, an authoritarian regulative approach to information is not viable by definition. This is a very Western idea of content. Having said that, of course, you can regulate certain areas. And if you, regulate through different approaches, globally speaking, then you have that amount of pluralism that ensures some sort of, tolerance to dynamics.
And Federico, any last thoughts from you?
No, I don't have particular thought on this question. I kind of agree with what Carlos said, to be honest.
Well, if nothing else, at least we've achieved consensus among our panel, which I think is a really good positive first step towards achieving consensus on content regulation. But thank you very much to our participants, Carlo and Federico. Thank you to everyone in the audience for providing excellent questions. I think my work here is done.
Thank you very much. Enjoy it.
Yeah. How did we say goodbye? We basically opened up a can of worms, and the worms are out. I'm not quite sure what we do with it, but I don't know if any closing reflections.
Well, I'll make a couple of closing statements. I think this was a really excellent panel, and I want to thank Dan, Carlo, and Federico for really insightful ideas. And one of the things that motivated that portion of the program was the idea that there might be analogical reasoning based on diverse areas. And I think at the highest level of generality, bank capital, financial regulation generally on one hand, and international taxation on the other hand, they both have kind of global externality issues, global cross-border issues that have been accentuated by various factors, by the growth of international financial markets, by the growth of international business. And indeed, as Carlo pointed out in his paper, the very idea of location of permanent establishment in the tax area has been challenged by these platforms. And the way that money is made is different in this area. And so those kinds of technological changes produce social changes. And then the next step is to consider what types of legal changes and what types of disruptions of political equilibrium that existed before have occurred because of those changes. And so what kinds of changed rules inside countries and then changed rules between countries might be necessary. And that's really what we've been thinking about. And there is a complex political dynamic. So one idea that I find attractive about the Brussels effect story is that once one of these transnational companies is subject to regulation in one place and has to adapt, it becomes cheap for it to adapt in other places. And indeed, it wants harmonious regulation in other places because of that ease of adaptation. And so you've actually seen that occur in the United States in response to the European General Data Protection Regulation. And the Biden administration has just made some important concessions on access to data in response to the European demand that was based on the GDPR. So you have a very interesting dynamic. And Europe has taken a leading role in some of these areas. But I think the question that will endure is what changes to politics, what changes to welfare occur because of this platform change. And I think the point that was made that we actually don't really, in most countries, have direct regulators that we can bring together, as Federico suggested, in a meeting in a single location for this area. It means we're kind of at the start of this issue, and we probably don't have the time to grow national regulators over a long period of time, have some kind of meetings, 5 or 10 years from now and figure this out. We need to act more immediately. And in a way, that's an advantage, because as we act more immediately, we may be able to act in a way that doesn't have unnecessary differentiation. So I think this is, I've been enjoying hearing about this. I found these panels incredibly illuminating for me and my understanding of these issues. And I want to thank everyone who participated in this, and especially Bhaskar and his team for their work.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Joel. I think each one of us can walk away with a few reflections on what we heard over the course of today. And I will not reiterate all of them. It's already late in the day, and all of you have been very patient in staying with us, both in room and in Zoom. I think over the course of just these open conversations, and even in sort of private bilateral conversations with some folks here, I saw the breadth of possibility or lack thereof. One person, and I'm not going to, I'm going to use Chazabno's rules here, not point to anybody in the room, but one person said that this is a lost cause because everything is going to move to distributed ledger technology. Is going to be decentralized, and once it's there, that genie cannot be put back in the bottle. The other extreme was that this is a mathematical problem that can be solved, and it is a matter of time, and that time can be compressed, and it is a solvable problem. So the reality, I'm sure, lies somewhere in that continuum. As to how we get there is what we don't quite know. So kind of to use that old adage of now that we've seen the light at the end of the tunnel, we now need to build the tunnel to get there. And I think the tunnel that we talked about over the course of actually all the panels is that this is not going to be a problem that's going to be solved by regulation. It's not going to be a problem that's going to be solved by the platforms alone. It's not going to be a problem that's going to be solved by education. It's not going to be a problem solved by civil society and users on their own. So we have to kind of find that messy middle model in order to get there. The whole issue is how quickly do we do that, and how much of the bad stuff do we eliminate before we go too much further into destroying some foundational institutions that I'm sure most people in the room are concerned about and care about, such as free speech, democracy, fairness, equity, inclusion, and all the other things that we cherish. And hopefully these platforms help reinforce them rather than take them down. I will send us off to what I think is the next item on the agenda, which is called a reception, which I think is, Dorothy, maybe you can explain to us whether that is the table that's standing behind you. But this really is an opportunity for us to, just acknowledge that, this is a problem that we should collectively try and wrestle to the ground. I think this event has been an incredible act of collaboration across a number of different stakeholders, both within the Fletcher School and across a number of organizations across multiple academic institutions, think tanks, organizations such as Omidyar Network, and several other organizations coming from civil society, media, and digital platforms. We had Meta, the biggest, of them all, present. So it was indeed a privilege to be able to, try to recognize that there's a shared problem, even if we don't have shared solutions. Within our team right here, I'm pretty sure none of us would be able to have enjoyed this opportunity to have this discussion. Despite the messiness of our start, we managed to actually launch into what was a very, very robust discussion. And thanks for making all that come together, the messiness of a hybrid collective, thanks to Anu Heror, Arpita Desai, Christina Filipovich, Chris Crumpton, Abhidami, Lisa Ravi Chaturvedi, Mitakshi, Lakhani, Patrick and Anastasia, and Maria Pereira, Nate Cole, Megan Boyle, and Dorothy Morselak, and Dominic Hofstetter, who's here in spirit, even though he's not in person. Have I missed out anybody? Oh, Evan, thank you, Evan. I haven't met you before, so apologize for not knowing your name, but thank you. There was obviously, the AV was an incredibly important part of this discussion. So thanks for helping us with that. With that, have a wonderful weekend, everybody, and stay away from misinformation.